chill hangs over the open sea, where steel hulls once cut through grey waves and isolated radio signals drift across vast, empty expanses. Imagine standing on the deck yourself, straining to catch a faint Morse code echo, knowing each message could be the last. Ships that carried lives and cargo vanished into storms, icy waters, or unseen currents, leaving behind fractured transmissions, incomplete logs, and haunting last words that still whisper through history. From the Barents Sea to the Atlantic, the ocean conceals wreckage and unanswered questions beneath its surface. Here, you follow the trail of these silent signals, tracing human endurance and maritime peril, and confronting the haunting reality of voices that were never heard again. The final signal of the SSL Faro. The slow advance of a storm-torn Atlantic morning carried a heavy, almost tangible weight, as though the horizon itself anticipated events that no mariner would willingly confront. East of the Bahamas, wind patterns shifted unpredictably, forming rolling corridors of dense, turbulent air that pressed against every cargo vessel in the region. Amid this growing tension, the SSL Faro maintained her voyage with the quiet determination expected of a seasoned commercial freighter, her decks busy with the routine of engines, lashings, and watch rotations. Containers, vehicles, and supplies were stowed carefully below, while officers monitored gauges and charts with the practiced calm of professionals accustomed to the sea's capricious temperament. On the surface, nothing appeared unusual. Beneath it, the ocean's latent fury gathered, indifferent to human vigilance. Subtle changes in barometric pressure hinted at the approaching threat, yet initial forecasts had placed the developing storm several hundred miles away. The El Faro, though aging, had plied Caribbean and Atlantic waters for decades, her machinery maintained under strict inspection schedules, her officers familiar with every hum and vibration of the ship. Even with these layers of preparation and experience, the surrounding environment began to shift in ways that suggested a far greater force emerging beyond the limits of observation. Swells climbed subtly, their peaks catching sunlight and throwing shadows across the deck, while the wind carried a hollow, resonant tone that seasoned mariners instinctively recognized as an omen of change. By mid-morning, Hurricane Joaquin intensified far more rapidly than predicted, its outer bands sweeping the waters with accelerating ferocity. The El Faro continued her routine reports via radio, each transmission precise and methodical, confirming her position, heading, and cargo status. Below decks, engineers monitored pumps and propulsion systems, adjusting as needed to maintain stability. The ship's route, calculated to navigate safely around common hazards, increasingly brought her uncomfortably close to the storm's heart. Even as officers noted the narrowing corridor of navigable water, communication remained measured, reflecting the professionalism of a crew trained to maintain composure under pressure. As wind gusts escalated into sustained forces, vibrations raced along the deck plating, signalling the strain of rising seas. Rain hammered the bridge windows in sheets, distorting the horizon into an indistinct grey expanse. The corridor of safe passage shrank, leaving retreat difficult and forward progress hazardous. The crew, attentive and methodical, performed constant checks, cargo lashings, bilge pumps, engine outputs. Each report conveyed information without panic, yet beneath their calm lay the recognition that conditions were approaching the limits of the vessel's capacity to endure. Mechanical failures soon compounded the peril. Seawater, driven by forceful waves, began infiltrating critical compartments, likely entering through ventilation shafts or damaged enclosures compromised by the storm. Propulsion faltered, leaving the El Faro exposed to the full impact of hurricane-driven seas. The deck listed sharply, and crew members navigated with caution across tilting surfaces, each step deliberate against the heaving motion of the freighter. Bridge officers relayed updates with precision, documenting the ship's orientation, flooding and structural stresses, their language formal, factual, and unwavering. In the midst of chaos, their calm reporting became both a lifeline and a record of mounting desperation. The captain's final transmission carried the urgency of circumstance while retaining professional clarity. He reported position, the severe list, engine failure, and rising water levels threatening critical compartments. The words were neither panicked nor fractured, merely direct, a precise account of a vessel struggling against forces beyond control. Around the ship, waves towered like jagged walls, erasing the horizon and battering the hull from every angle. Even modern search and rescue capabilities would have struggled to reach her in such conditions, and the magnitude of the hurricane rendered intervention nearly impossible. Within moments, contact ceased. The bridge fell silent, the constant hum of engines and radios replaced by the deafening roar of wind and water. Amid this, the captain's final audible words were recorded, "All right, good night." Ordinary phrasing, yet in context profoundly haunting, a simple acknowledgement of human presence swallowed almost instantly by the sea. In those last moments, the El Faro was both a vessel and a vanishing echo, its crew caught at the intersection of skill, preparation, and nature's overwhelming authority. The storm passed, leaving the Atlantic strewn with scattered debris. Fragments of containers, broken equipment, and pieces of cargo marked the faintest traces of the ship's passage. Investigators compiled these remnants alongside voyage data, recorder outputs, and radio transmissions to reconstruct a partial sequence of events. Maintenance records confirmed the vessel had been inspected, engines functional, and crews experienced, yet the precise circumstances that caused the ship to succumb remained obscured beneath the hurricane's vast indifferent power. Underwater surveys eventually located the wreck nearly 3 miles beneath the surface, the hull upright yet bearing clear signs of violent stress. No human remains were recovered, emphasizing the sudden and absolute nature of the disaster. Analysis of the vessel's condition and the environmental data suggested multiple contributing factors: rapid hurricane intensification, mechanical vulnerability once propulsion was lost, and the impossibility of maneuvering within the narrowing corridor of deepening waves. Even so, the final moments of the El Faro and her crew could only be inferred, leaving the human experience of those final hours forever beyond reach. The recorded final transmissions of the El Faro remain etched in maritime history, their calm precision a stark contrast to the storm's fury. They offer clarity in noting the ship's position and compromised state while simultaneously deepening the mystery of its final disappearance. Even in the era of advanced navigation and monitoring, the El Faro illustrates the limits of human control over nature, where preparation and experience meet the unpredictable magnitude of a hurricane. Beneath the weight of the Atlantic, the last words linger, an echo of a crew's struggle, a vessel's endurance, and the silence that followed, suspended forever between presence and oblivion. The silent shutdown of MV Derbyshire. Far out in the western Pacific, the ocean stretched in vast rolling swells that erased any sense of scale, a deep expanse where even the largest ships seemed fragile and fleeting. Shipping lanes threaded between typhoon corridors and seasonal wind patterns, forming invisible highways across thousands of miles of open water. Among these vessels sailed the MV Derbyshire, a British ore carrier bound from Canada to Japan, her holds heavy with iron ore. Her enormous hull, more than 290 metres in length, conveyed both power and vulnerability, a combination that would soon vanish entirely, leaving only a silent absence on the waves she had once traversed. Crews aboard bulk carriers like the Derbyshire operated with constant awareness of the Pacific's subtle rhythms, the slow drift of currents, the undulations of swells, and the faint changes in wind direction that could signal far-off storms. The Derbyshire, one of the largest British ships ever built, was a fully welded vessel embodying the standards of late 1970s maritime engineering. Her hull was reinforced to carry immense weight, her frame regularly tested for structural integrity, and her engines maintained for consistent operation. For those aboard, the voyage was routine, a continuation of decades of similar crossings, yet the vastness of the Pacific concealed perils beyond the reach of even the most prepared seafarers. The Derbyshire advanced with steady inevitability, her bow cleaving the rolling swells, steel frames and bulkheads absorbing immense pressures as the cargo shifted imperceptibly beneath decks. These minor movements, typical aboard a heavily laden bulk carrier, became significant under the weight of nearly 160,000 tons of ore. Each creak and vibration was part of the normal rhythm of a ship under strain, yet in hindsight these sounds form an ominous prelude to the events that followed. The ocean's persistent force pressed upon the vessel from every angle, subtle at first, then inexorably increasing as Typhoon Orchid gathered strength far beyond the horizon. The ship's construction reflected confidence in engineering, compartmentalised holds, reinforced frames, and fully welded decks designed to prevent flooding even under extreme conditions. Pre-voyage inspections confirmed the integrity of the hull, and the crew, seasoned in trans-Pacific operations, trusted the Derbyshire to endure what the ocean would present. Still, no structural assessment could anticipate the convergence of circumstances that the storm would produce, a sudden, overwhelming force that would strike with devastating efficiency. As Orchid intensified, barometric drops and shifting currents generated rolling, chaotic swells across the region. At first, these shifts were subtle, noticeable only to officers trained to read waves and radar. Weather updates indicated the storm's trajectory but offered no immediate signal of imminent danger. Routine radio transmissions continued, reporting position, heading, and speed, reinforcing a perception of normal operations even as the storm approached. The calmness of communication contrasted starkly with the hidden intensity of the sea, a silence that would come to define the Derbyshire's final voyage. The eerie reality of the Derbyshire lies in what was never recorded. Unlike many maritime tragedies, there was no distress call, no final utterances, no voice recordings from the bridge. The last communications consisted solely of operational reports, delivered without any hint of threat or urgency. In an ocean region notorious for sudden storms, the absence of final messages added a chilling layer to the disaster, leaving investigators and mariners alike to confront the possibility of total loss without any human witness. Search efforts retraced the Derbyshire's projected path, focusing on regions where Typhoon Orchid swells reached their greatest intensity. The Pacific, immense and unrelenting, offered no floating debris, no oil slick, no scattered cargo to guide searchers. Investigators relied on vessel design data, cargo manifests, storm reconstructions, and reports from neighbouring ships to piece together the probable sequence of events. Everything suggested that the forces acting upon the vessel were sudden and catastrophic, yet not a single voice had been captured to narrate the ordeal. It would be decades before the wreck was located nearly 3 miles beneath the surface, lying broken along a slope in a manner consistent with structural failure under extreme stress. Remotely operated vehicles revealed fractured hatch covers and twisted steel, evidence of progressive collapse under the combined weight of cargo and wave force. Analysts concluded that water entered compromised compartments, triggering a rapid loss of buoyancy and the abrupt sinking of the freighter. The absence of recorded last words intensifies the tragedy. Families of the 44 crew members never heard the final moments. No cries for help, no reassurance, no human sound to mark the end. Maritime investigators emphasise that this silence is central to the story. The Derbyshire did not simply sink, it disappeared without a trace of human voice, an occurrence almost unique among modern shipping disasters. The storm itself played a decisive role. Typhoon Orchid produced unusually high, concentrated waves over a compact but violent area, overwhelming structural points such as hatch covers and deck reinforcements. Even the Derbyshire's robust design could not withstand the repeated impact of water and shifting cargo. These physical forces explain the lack of distress signals. The disaster was instantaneous, leaving no opportunity for transmission. The case reshaped understanding of bulk carrier vulnerabilities, leading to stricter inspections of hatch integrity, reinforced framing, and revised operational protocols in typhoon-prone regions. Yet the defining feature remains the silence. The Derbyshire left no words behind, only evidence of what occurred, a testament to the ocean's capacity to overwhelm human monitoring and preparation. Even today, the Derbyshire endures as a symbol of maritime power and uncertainty. Investigators and historians can reconstruct the storm's intensity, map cargo loads, and assess structural failure, but the human experience, the crew's final realization of peril, remains unknowable. No messages, no bridge recordings, no fleeting signals survived. Only the silent depths preserve the memory of a ship and her crew, swallowed by the Pacific, an absence as complete as it is haunting. No final words were ever transmitted from the MV Derbyshire, leaving the last moments of her crew entirely unrecorded and the ocean itself as the sole witness to their fate. The last weather check of SS Marine Electric. The Western Atlantic swelled under a brooding sky, grey and low, a restless expanse that seemed almost to breathe with hidden force. Merchant ships traversing these waters often faced capricious weather, and the SS Marine Electric, a sturdy but aging bulk carrier, moved through the waves with the careful precision demanded by both cargo and crew. Laden with a dense shipment of coal, the vessel's hull rode low in the water, each swell pressing upon the steel frame with a subtle, continuous pressure. For the 34 men aboard, this voyage had begun as any other, with schedules, routines, and weather checks shaping the rhythm of life far from port, yet the Atlantic was poised to turn this ordinary crossing into a permanent silence. The Marine Electric had been a familiar presence along the mid-Atlantic shipping lanes, its service record marked by diligence rather than notoriety. Launched during the late 1940s, the ship had carried bulk cargoes for decades, enduring storms and long passages with only routine maintenance and minor repairs. Yet by February of 1983, her age was more than a number. Hull plates had thinned, equipment showed years of wear, and the stresses of decades at sea made each voyage a test of both engineering and human judgment. The crew understood this reality, noting it in logs and inspections, but there remained confidence in the vessel's ability to complete the journey from Norfolk to Virginia ports, even under winter storms. The atmosphere on board the Marine Electric that February evening reflected the usual mix of vigilance and monotony. Officers monitored radar, weather reports, and the ship's instruments, while deckhands managed hatches and cargo. Outside, the waves rose into rolling frothy crests, and wind gusts lashed at the superstructure, carrying the stinging spray of icy Atlantic waters. Every movement of the ship produced a chorus of metallic groans from the aging hull, a sound familiar enough to the crew to blend into background noise, yet ominous when remembered in hindsight as part of the vessel's final hours. Routine radio communications had long been a lifeline for ships crossing these waters, allowing updates on position, weather, and coordination with port authorities. In the case of the Marine Electric, no final distress call or recorded transmission was ever sent as the storm overtook the vessel. The crew's last words, if they were ever spoken over the radio, were lost to the Atlantic along with the ship itself. In the absence of any communication, the silence becomes the most haunting element, a chilling reminder of how abruptly a routine voyage could end, and how utterly the sea can erase human presence. The storm that engulfed the vessel that afternoon was typical of the season in its intensity, but extraordinary in its suddenness. Winds accelerated unpredictably, and waves built with relentless consistency, each one taller and heavier than the last. Investigators later determined that the combination of wind, swells, and the vessel's low draft produced conditions that stressed the hull beyond safe tolerances. Coal cargo, heavy and unevenly distributed despite the crew's precautions, shifted with each roll, amplifying the vessel's instability. Below decks, the grinding, groaning steel pressed against the holds as the vessel pitched and yawed in the relentless ocean, a physical dialogue between ship and sea. In reviewing the Marine Electric's history, engineers noted that the vessel had been subject to several structural modifications and repairs over its decades of service. Reinforcements, hatch cover replacements, and patching had maintained seaworthiness, but could not erase the cumulative effect of years at sea. Metal fatigue and corrosion rendered the ship more vulnerable than any chart or inspection could fully capture. The crew, despite experience and diligence, would have had no way of anticipating the confluence of forces that eventually overtook them, and the lack of any subsequent radio communication underscores how abruptly the disaster struck. The eerie dimension of the Marine Electric story emerges in the contrast between routine and catastrophe. That final weather report, sent with the same careful precision as countless others before it, stands against the backdrop of sudden obliteration. The ocean swallowed the ship swiftly and silently, leaving no debris field visible at the surface for days. Search efforts, constrained by the storm's aftermath and the vastness of the mid-Atlantic, initially yielded nothing. Mariners and rescuers were left with only the knowledge that the vessel had vanished after its last routine transmission, a haunting gap between the ordinary and the unknowable. When wreckage was finally located months later, examination revealed the likely cause of the sinking: progressive flooding through hatch covers compromised by storm damage and age. Coal cargo, water intrusion, and structural stress combined to overwhelm the ship's buoyancy. Sections of hull plating were fractured, revealing the immense pressures exerted by the ocean and the ship's own weight. Investigators emphasized that the sinking was sudden and catastrophic, leaving no opportunity for further communications. In the absence of recorded last words, the Marine Electric's final weather check endures as the only testament to the crew's last active engagement with the outside world. Survivor accounts do not exist, yet the human dimension remains tangible. Families of the crew were left with silence, piecing together the final hours from procedural reports and maritime records. Each transmission before the disaster was routine, professional, and uneventful in tone, yet in retrospect carries profound weight. The vessel's disappearance, without final cries or warning beyond the ordinary weather check, transformed these daily procedural words into a symbol of unresolved loss, an ordinary final act made extraordinary by absence and consequence. Maritime historians often note that the Marine Electric disaster illustrates the dual nature of modern seafaring, reliance on technology and procedure versus vulnerability to natural forces. Radar, radios, and weather reports could monitor and inform, but they could not prevent a sudden catastrophe when an aging vessel encountered a storm capable of overwhelming structural limits. The last weather check is therefore emblematic, capturing both the normalcy of life aboard a ship and the abruptness with which it can end. No dramatic final words exist, but in its factual simplicity, the routine transmission resonates more hauntingly than any improvised plea might have. The legacy of the Marine Electric has had a lasting impact on maritime safety standards. Hatch covers, cargo securing procedures, and winter sailing protocols were all reviewed and revised following the investigation. Yet the human mystery endures. The 34 men aboard were never heard from again, their final moments unrecorded. The Atlantic itself remains the sole witness, and the procedural, factual weather check, calm, methodical, and unremarkable at the time, stands in place of last words, a ghostly echo in maritime history. Every element of the story, ship design, cargo weight, storm intensity, and procedural transmissions, converges to form a narrative of sudden, irreversible loss. The ordinary words of the last weather check now carry extraordinary significance, a marker of human presence erased by the ocean's indifference. In recounting the Marine Electric, the tension between routine operations and absolute catastrophe creates a haunting rhythm, a reminder that silence can be as potent as any shouted plea, and that the final trace of human life can be measured in the most unassuming record. In a sudden sweep, the Atlantic claimed the Marine Electric, leaving its last weather report as the only trace of a crew never heard from again. The unanswered call from MV Sewol. A gentle haze hung over the waters near Jindo Island as the MV Sewol carried its cargo along familiar shipping lanes, the hum of engines blending with the restless rhythm of the sea. The ferry, a large roll-on/roll-off vessel, had been entrusted with dozens of vehicles and hundreds of passengers on its route from Incheon to Jeju Island, its decks laden with buses, cars, and freight. The bridge crew monitored instruments with steady attention, aware of the complex balance between cargo weight, passenger safety, and the fickle currents of the Yellow Sea. On that fateful day, the first recorded warning of disaster arrived not as a roar or explosion, but in the crew's terse transmission noting a sudden and severe list that would become the ferry's last words to the outside world. The ferry had been designed for both vehicles and passengers, its decks stacked with buses, cars, and freight, while the crew maintained routines shaped by years of navigating the coastal channels of South Korea. Inspectors had noted modifications to its hull and cargo holds, some intended to increase capacity but which compromised stability under adverse conditions. The bridge team, experienced yet human, relied on standard procedures to monitor weight distribution and deck integrity, aware that even small lapses in securing cargo could produce cascading effects. These preparations, routine on ordinary voyages, were powerless against the rapid progression of events that would soon overtake them. Clouds thickened and winds nudged the vessel off course, a subtle agitation that hinted at the volatility hidden within the grey swells and shifting cargo. Waves pressed against the hull with a rhythm that grew more insistent, and the ferry began to roll more heavily than normal. The sea, usually a predictable companion, now moved with a restless and unpredictable energy. Crew members noted minor tilts and oscillations, standard occurrences on coastal crossings, but the combination of vehicle weight, water ballast, and wave force would quickly amplify these minor disturbances into a dangerous imbalance. Within moments, alarms echoed from the bridge as the ship began an unexpected tilt, and the crew transmitted the first recorded notice of a severe list to authorities, marking the beginning of a rapidly unfolding crisis. The captain's voice, precise but urgent, communicated both location and the nature of the emergency, a professional acknowledgement that the vessel's stability had been compromised. Passengers were unaware of the gravity at first, as crew members moved quickly to assess the situation and implement emergency procedures. In hindsight, this recorded transmission stands as a haunting artifact, the last organised words from a crew facing an overwhelming and immediate threat. Officers scrambled to stabilise the ferry, issuing orders and manoeuvring the rudder with precision born of training, yet the momentum of shifting vehicles and water pressure worked against them with relentless efficiency. Decks tilted alarmingly as buses and trucks slid along their secured positions, smashing into barriers and other cargo. Crew members fought to counteract the movement, deploying ballast adjustments and attempting to right the vessel while simultaneously maintaining communication with rescue authorities. Every decision was measured, every command delivered with focus, yet the sea and the combined weight of hundreds of tons of vehicles refused to yield. Steel groaned under the uneven weight and incoming waves, hatches strained at their fittings, and the vessel's structure succumbed incrementally to forces beyond human intervention, leading to the catastrophic overturning. The ship's design, adequate under normal conditions, proved insufficient against the dynamic imbalance created by shifting cargo. Flooding began in the lower decks, increasing the list and pulling the ferry further into instability. The metal hull, once a symbol of engineered safety, became a conduit for disaster, transmitting every wave's pressure through the ship and intensifying the chaos inside. Radio transmissions faltered as the tilt worsened, and the bridge crew's final recorded words were brief but urgent. "We have a severe list. Request assistance immediately." Static soon overtook the signal and no further messages were received. Investigators later noted that the abruptness of these transmissions underscored how quickly the ferry succumbed to the instability caused by shifting cargo and water ingress. The vessel's emergency systems activated, but the combination of human reaction time, cargo movement, and water ingress made any prolonged communication impossible. In this stark silence, the recorded warning of the list becomes more than a routine distress report. It is the only audible trace of the crew's struggle against forces that could not be mitigated. By the time search and rescue teams arrived, the fury of wind and tide had scattered debris and obscured any clear path, turning the sea into both witness and obstacle to the desperate attempt to save lives. Helicopters scanned the surface for survivors, while boats navigated treacherous waves to reach those who had escaped into lifeboats or the water. Survivors later recounted disorientation and confusion, highlighting the violent speed at which the ferry capsized. The ocean, indifferent and vast, swallowed the vessel's majority instantly, leaving only isolated fragments that hinted at the scale of the catastrophe. Subsequent inquiries revealed a combination of overloaded cargo, unsecured vehicles, and procedural lapses, each factor contributing to a chain of failures that culminated in the vessel's disappearance from routine view. Investigators examined weight records, vessel modifications, and crew actions, concluding that a failure to properly secure heavy vehicles on the top decks dramatically increased the list when the ship encountered moderate waves. These findings, while technical, provide context for the urgency present in the last recorded communications, demonstrating that the bridge crew had identified the danger but had mere minutes to react. Families, communities, and maritime authorities were left piecing together moments of chaos, reading the sparse final transmissions over and over, searching for meaning in the abrupt silence that followed. Memorials and investigative reports preserve the factual account, but they cannot recover the voices lost at sea. The combination of human vulnerability, environmental force, and mechanical limitations created a tragedy defined not only by death, but also by the eerie weight of words left hanging in the void, a final signal of awareness never met with response. The last words recorded from the bridge linger as a spectral echo over the waters they vanished into, leaving a question that the sea itself has never answered. The final transmission of HMS Erebus. A low Arctic sun barely pierced the fog over the ice-choked waters as HMS Erebus and her companion vessel pressed into the unknown reaches of the Northwest Passage. the crew unaware that these frozen channels would become the final stage of their journey. The ships moved with caution through the narrow leads of open water between ice floes, their hulls groaning under the pressure of shifting sheets of frozen sea. The cold was absolute, seeping into every joint, every layer of clothing, and even the thick timbers of the vessels themselves. For the men aboard, the silence of the Arctic was both oppressive and absolute, broken only by the occasional scrape of ice against hull or the distant cry of a seabird. In this isolation, no distress call would ever be heard beyond the ice. No human voice would carry Erebus's fate to the wider world. The Erebus, a heavily armed bomb vessel retrofitted for polar exploration, carried both sailors and scientific observers whose routines were dictated by the cold, the ice, and the careful maintenance of every rope, sail, and instrument. The vessel's design, reinforced for navigating polar waters, could withstand immense pressure, yet it was not invulnerable. Officers logged wind direction, temperature, and the drift of ice flows, while seamen laboured to keep decks clear of snow and ice, constantly attending to the rigging. Supplies of fresh water, food, and coal were carefully rationed, and the sense of order aboard contrasted with the unpredictable chaos just beyond the hull. Every measure of vigilance could only mitigate the hazards of the ice and the unyielding Arctic climate. It could not guarantee survival. Currents shifted unpredictably through the labyrinth of flows, forcing careful navigation that tested both the ship's design and the crew's skill, while the Arctic silence heightened the sense of isolation around every turn. Icebergs loomed in the distance like frozen sentinels, their jagged edges reflecting weak sunlight and casting long shadows across the water. The officers relied on charts, compasses, and careful observation, yet even the most detailed maps offered only a partial understanding of a landscape constantly in motion. One misjudgment could trap the vessels in ice, a slow and inexorable grip that left no avenue of retreat. Pack ice pressed relentlessly against the hull, its jagged edges scraping wood and iron, while the endless expanse of whiteness seemed to close in on every side, erasing familiar landmarks and leaving the men disoriented in an alien frozen expanse. Frost formed on railings, ropes, and instruments, while every gust of wind carried sharp, biting cold that sapped energy and morale. The deck became treacherous, and the men moved with care, aware that one misstep could result in injury or exposure to the icy waters. Despite their training, the Arctic remained a landscape both beautiful and indifferent, a realm in which human endeavour was fleeting and fragile. Routine log entries recorded temperature, wind direction, and the extent of ice drift, notes that now serve as the only documented traces of the ship's final movements, a quiet testament to the crew's diligence in an environment that would allow no further words. No distress calls were ever sent, no messages transmitted beyond the frozen horizon. The Arctic swallowed every trace of human voice. These entries, meticulous and factual, stand as the Erebus's last transmission to history, marking her presence and passage without ever revealing the ultimate fate that awaited her or the men aboard. In their silence, these logs carry a weight that words of panic could never convey, a record of human endeavour confronted by the vast, immovable forces of nature. Supplies dwindled as days of icy confinement wore on. Fatigue seeped into the ranks, and every adjustment of sail or oar carried the weight of life or death consequence. Yet no message could escape the frozen grip of the Arctic to alert the outside world. Sailors laboured to keep the decks clear and the rigging functional, their movements precise yet weary, while officers weighed every decision against both the danger of ice pressure and the risk of navigation errors. The relentless environment left no room for error or delay. Each moment was a calculation in survival. The crew's dedication persisted, but no outward communication was possible beyond the recorded observations in the log. Erebus simply vanished from all official records after her last entries, leaving only empty channels of Arctic water where once a ship had ploughed through ice and fog, and no voice or signal survived to mark her fate. For years, explorers and historians speculated on the disappearance, piecing together clues from other voyages, Inuit oral histories, and environmental patterns, yet no direct message ever confirmed the final moments. The ship's absence became absolute, a void in both geography and record, where silence replaced certainty and imagination attempted to fill the gaps left by time and ice. Centuries later, sonar scans and underwater exploration revealed the shipwreck resting beneath shifting ice and sediment, artifacts providing tangible evidence of the crew's final environment, but no answers to the questions that linger. The hull, preserved by cold and silt, offered insight into construction, cargo, and placement, yet could not reveal the final choices of those aboard. Personal items, tools, and fragments of supplies confirmed the presence of human life, but left unanswered the most pressing question: how and when did Erebus meet her end? Every recovered object became a fragment of a story, a silent witness to events that no voice survived to tell. Historians and scientists have pieced together potential sequences of events from recovered items and Inuit accounts, yet every theory encounters gaps in evidence, leaving the disappearance of Erebus as enigmatic as the frozen expanse that claimed her. Ice drift patterns, reports of abandoned camps, and traces of provision storage have suggested partial timelines, but conjecture must be carefully distinguished from verified fact. Even today, the ship's final position, the decisions of her officers, and the fate of her crew remain partially obscured by the Arctic's indifference, creating a persistent tension between what is known and what may never be known. The men aboard faced relentless cold, hunger, and isolation, and their final routines, preserved only in meticulous logs, underscore the human struggle against an environment that tolerated no error. Yet the broader story resonates as a cautionary tale of exploration and ambition. Every recorded observation, every maintenance log, is now a ghostly testimony to the diligence and courage required to navigate such a hostile realm. The Arctic had the power to erase ships and people alike, leaving only the meticulous recording of routine as evidence that they had once been there. Over the Arctic expanse that claimed HMS Erebus, silence endures, a frozen testament to a journey whose last words were never heard beyond the pages of a logbook. The radio cut off aboard MV Joyita. Mechanical hums and the creak of steel filled MV Joyita as she sailed her usual route across the South Pacific, the quiet routines aboard masking a problem that would soon become a perplexing disappearance. The freighter, carrying a small cargo load and a skeleton crew, moved with the steady rhythm of a ship accustomed to routine operations, yet subtle disturbances, engine sputters, leaking compartments, hinted at complications beneath the surface. For the crew, the day had begun like any other, with navigation checks, maintenance duties, and routine radio communications that connected them, however briefly, to distant port authorities. One such transmission, noting minor mechanical issues, would become the final record of human voice aboard, leaving only silence to follow. Joyita, built as a coastal freighter and lightly armed, was not designed for the vast expanses of the open ocean, though her hull was reinforced for durability in nearshore waters. Her decks were functional but narrow, with limited lifeboats and only modest safety equipment by modern standards. The cargo consisted of general supplies intended for scattered islands and smaller ports, and the crew was experienced but small in number, accustomed to long days of manual labour under tropical sun and occasional storm conditions. The ship's design and purpose offered efficiency in calm waters, but left her vulnerable when circumstances grew uncertain. Reports over the radio had already hinted at the vessel's mechanical troubles. The engine had been sputtering for days, and small leaks in the hull or cargo holds were noted by the crew in routine log entries. These messages, transmitted over short-range frequencies to nearby stations or passing vessels, were factual and unembellished, describing only what could be observed. Beyond this, no communication survived. There were no panicked calls, no distress signals, just the faint trace of a ship grappling with normal operational challenges that had quietly escalated into a dangerous situation. Isolation at sea amplified every difficulty Joyita faced. Waves rose in unanticipated swells, trade winds intensified without warning, and there were no other ships within a day's sail capable of offering assistance. Mechanical failure became a critical liability in a setting where the ocean could exact severe consequences for even minor mishaps. The crew's knowledge of their environment, navigation skills, and maintenance discipline were all tested simultaneously, and any mistake could have catastrophic outcomes. The vastness of the Pacific ensured that even routine difficulties could transform into mysteries of survival or disappearance. Maintenance logs and crew notes suggested repeated repairs, evidence of a ship struggling against its own limitations while carrying out its daily course. Engines were adjusted, bilge pumps monitored, and hatches sealed as best as possible. yet the strain of continuous operation, combined with the effects of wear and saltwater corrosion, foreshadowed the vessel's sudden and baffling disappearance. While mechanical failure is a known hazard of maritime operations, the abruptness of Joyita's vanishing amplified the mystery and left investigators with almost no clues about what transpired during the final hours of her journey. Then, radio silence. Partial reports ceased without warning, leaving operators and maritime authorities with only fragments of communication and no final words to clarify the crew's fate. Unlike other maritime disappearances where a distress signal or last words give insight into the moment of crisis, Joyita left only incomplete traces of her presence. The absence of recorded last words became itself a point of suspense, a void in the historical record that has challenged investigators for decades. In this silence, the story of the crew's final moments became inseparable from the enigmatic nature of the abandoned ship. Weeks later, Joyita was discovered adrift and unmanned. The freighter floated partially damaged, with lifeboats missing and interior equipment showing signs of hasty or incomplete activity. Cargo was in disarray, some items washed across the deck, yet there were no bodies to account for. The state of the ship suggested abrupt departure or evacuation, but there was no corroborating evidence of what caused the crew to leave, or if they had even abandoned the vessel at all. The freighter's condition presented a riddle. The vessel survived, yet the people aboard did not leave a trace. Inspecting Joyita's bridge revealed instruments frozen mid-readings, dials stuck at unusual angles, and charts scattered as if dropped in haste, hinting at a sudden interruption of normal operations. Investigators also noted that personal items such as hats and logbooks were left behind, suggesting the crew departed in a hurry or never had the chance to leave at all. The ship's radio equipment was powered down, its wiring intact but silent, leaving unanswered the questions about what might have been attempted in those final moments. Tiny clues, such as a half-filled cup in the galley and untouched navigational charts, offered fleeting glimpses of daily life abruptly halted, reinforcing the eerie uncertainty of the vessel's fate. Investigators examined the ship with meticulous care, documenting water ingress, engine failure, and the state of cargo and supplies. They noted small but persistent leaks, the effects of salt water on machinery, and inconsistencies in how equipment had been secured. No evidence suggested deliberate sabotage or violent encounter. Instead, the findings pointed to mechanical strain, human decision-making under pressure, and possibly environmental factors interacting in a way that led to abandonment or loss at sea. Despite this, forensic and archival records could not provide a complete answer. Joyita's fate remained an open question, the empty vessel a witness without testimony. Maritime historians and naval analysts have offered a range of theories to explain Joyita's disappearance. Storms in the region, combined with mechanical limitations and operational decisions, are often cited as contributing factors. Human error or the challenges of maintaining an aging ship under extended voyage conditions are another plausible explanation. Yet the total absence of the crew, the lack of definitive distress communication beyond the partial updates, and the mysterious state of the ship leave all conclusions as educated speculation. The case continues to intrigue both scholars and the public, its ambiguities providing fertile ground for inquiry and fascination. The human dimension of the story is no less compelling. A small crew, each responsible for multiple duties, faced the escalating demands of a vessel operating at its limits. Mechanical failures, unpredictable weather, and the vastness of their environment created a situation in which ordinary routines could transform into extraordinary danger. Whatever occurred aboard Joyita, it left no voice to narrate the experience, no last words to echo across the waves, and no survivors to recount events. Their absence stands as a reminder of the ocean's capacity to isolate, challenge, and obscure human endeavour. The Pacific waters that held MV Joyita in their sway continue to whisper no answers, leaving the ship's sudden abandonment as a riddle suspended between ocean and sky. The last routine report of MS Munchen. MS Munchen had maintained a routine that day, her bridge busy with navigational checks and crew coordinating standard operations, unaware that her final report would soon mark the last trace of normality. The German cargo liner travelling across the North Atlantic had been lauded for its modern design, combining reliable engine performance with technological instruments intended to ensure smooth transits through heavy seas. Crew members moved with practiced efficiency, performing their tasks with confidence, while the ship's daily rhythm proceeded with a familiarity born of countless voyages across the same routes. In these ordinary movements lay the last imprint of human presence aboard, a prelude to the sudden and perplexing silence that would follow. Constructed in the 1970s, Mississippi Munchen was among the most advanced freighters of her time, featuring a robust hull, multiple cargo holds, and a bridge equipped with state-of-the-art navigational systems. The ship's size and design allowed her to carry significant cargo while remaining relatively swift for a vessel of her class. Though technologically modern, the design still faced inherent challenges posed by the North Atlantic. Sudden swells, strong currents, and storm-prone weather could exploit vulnerabilities in hull stress points or cargo stowage. The combination of human operation, mechanical endurance, and environmental factors created a delicate balance, one that would be disrupted in ways the crew could neither foresee nor report. Loaded with diverse goods ranging from bulk materials to packaged commodities, the ship's cargo holds later drew attention from maritime engineers, who noted that the stowage could have affected the vessel's centre of gravity under heavy swell. MS Munchen's design included multiple ballast tanks intended to adjust stability, yet experts speculated that under certain conditions, abrupt shifts in cargo or ballast could magnify stress on the hull. These technical considerations, combined with routine weight distribution practices, highlight a delicate balance between operational efficiency and maritime safety, a balance that may have played a role in the vessel's sudden and unexplained disappearance. The day before her disappearance had begun like any other, with crew members performing engine inspections, updating charts, and preparing cargo holds for routine transfers. Radio communications with coastal stations remained normal, and position reports were transmitted according to standard schedules. These routine messages offered reassurance to authorities monitoring the liner, providing a sense of continuity and operational normalcy. One such report, brief and procedural, would ultimately become the last routine communication from the ship, a record of ordinary maritime life frozen in time. Despite this veneer of normality, the North Atlantic had a reputation for unpredictability that tested even experienced sailors. Winds shifted rapidly, creating unexpected swells, while cold currents and occasional fog reduced visibility and increased navigational complexity. For a vessel like MS Munchen, even minor deviations from the predicted course could require rapid adjustments to maintain stability. The bridge crew, familiar with these hazards, relied on both technology and training, yet the ocean's subtle threats remained omnipresent, a reminder that routine alone could never fully mitigate risk. Early signs of trouble emerged almost imperceptibly. Slight deviations in speed and minor course corrections, logged routinely, were among the few indicators that the ship was not entirely on its intended path. While these details were unremarkable in isolation, they later assumed significance as investigators pieced together the ship's last known movements. No distress signals preceded the anomalies, and the crew's final routine report did not reflect any sense of danger, leaving only fragments of procedural notes to hint at underlying challenges the vessel faced. Hours after the last routine report, a cryptic and distorted transmission was received by monitoring stations. The signal was brief, garbled, and difficult to interpret, with only fragments of words discernible amid static. Analysts later described it as incomplete and irregular, providing the only indication that something had shifted from routine to crisis. The lack of clarity in the transmission left authorities uncertain whether the crew was attempting to report mechanical issues, navigational concerns, or environmental hazards. In the absence of further communication, the distorted signal became a haunting puzzle, suggesting urgency without revealing cause. After the cryptic transmission, all communication ceased. The sudden silence compounded the mystery, leaving maritime authorities with only the routine position report and the fragmented signal as evidence of the vessel's final hours. Unlike other cases where last words or distress calls hinted events aboard, Mississippi Munchen offered no such guidance. Investigators were confronted with a void, where expectation of a final message was replaced with uncertainty, forcing a reliance on indirect clues, technical data, and environmental analysis to reconstruct the sequence of events. Search efforts were launched immediately upon confirmation of the communication blackout. Naval vessels and aircraft combed the ship's expected route, yet found only small patches of debris and oil slicks scattered without pattern. No trace of crew or intact sections of the liner emerged, heightening the mystery. The absence of survivors or clear wreckage left the final movements of MS Munchen entirely speculative. Observers noted that the condition of recovered debris suggested a sudden, catastrophic event rather than gradual deterioration or abandonment, reinforcing the perplexity of the disappearance. Investigative findings relied heavily on the ship's design, cargo manifest, and environmental data. Analyses suggested that rogue waves, structural stress, or sudden shifts in cargo weight could have contributed to capsizing or mechanical failure. The cryptic transmission remained a singular anomaly, a partial voice of the crew abruptly cut short. While technical assessments could hypothesize plausible scenarios, no conclusive determination emerged, leaving the disappearance officially classified as mysterious and unresolved. Theories regarding MS Munchen's fate abound in maritime circles. Some experts speculate that extreme weather or rogue waves overwhelmed the vessel's structure, while others point to the possibility of equipment malfunction or unforeseen stress on the hull. The distorted signal has also fueled conjecture, suggesting the crew may have recognized danger too late to issue a coherent distress call. Each hypothesis is tempered by the lack of direct evidence, preserving the enigmatic nature of the case and the unanswered questions surrounding the ship's final hours. The human element remains central to the story. The crew's routines, decision-making, and vigilance were all documented in the last report and partial signal, offering glimpses into life aboard a modern freighter. These routines, frozen by the abrupt cut-off of communication, underscore the fragility of human presence in a vast, indifferent environment. MS Munchen vanished with all hands, leaving behind only procedural notes, a garbled transmission, and an enduring question of what transpired in the hours following the routine report. The routine and cryptic transmissions of MS Munchen endure as the only echoes of the vessel's journey, a record of human presence abruptly severed, leaving the North Atlantic with its unanswered questions. The disappearing voice of SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Inside the bridge of SS Edmund Fitzgerald, instruments hummed with quiet efficiency as the crew maintained their steady course across Lake Superior. The vessel, fully laden with iron ore concentrates, moved with the precision expected of a freighter of its size, each crew member attentive to gauges, engine outputs, and navigational readings. Captain Ernest McSorley oversaw operations with measured authority, aware of the lake's historical volatility, yet confident in the ship's capabilities. The massive hull of the Fitzgerald, designed to carry tens of thousands of tons of iron ore, reflected both engineering ambition and the inherent vulnerability of such a laden freighter. Built to navigate the Great Lakes with strength and efficiency, the ship embodied decades of design evolution, balancing cargo capacity with seaworthiness. The Fitzgerald's superstructure, though sturdy, was not immune to the combination of weight, wave height, and wind pressure that would define its final hours. Morning routines unfolded with practiced precision, from engine room inspections to chart updates, a rhythm that gave every crew member a sense of security despite the approaching storm. Engine logs were meticulously checked, navigation instruments recalibrated, and lookout stations manned with an unspoken understanding that vigilance was paramount. The bridge team exchanged brief, factual communications, each confirming the ship's heading, speed, and cargo stability. In these small exchanges, the ordinary work of a freighter at sea seemed almost ceremonial, yet they marked the final moments before the lake's tempest would assert its dominance. Even on familiar waters, Lake Superior's temperament could shift with terrifying suddenness, producing waves and wind patterns that could test the limits of even the most modern vessels. Mariners on the Great Lakes knew the stories of rogue waves and squalls that appeared without warning, capable of overwhelming a freighter's ballast and hull strength. For the Fitzgerald, November had brought cold fronts and unsettled air masses that hinted at the potential for conditions that were as treacherous as the open ocean, yet deceptive in their sudden onset. Iron ore concentrates filled the cargo holds, and the careful distribution of weight was critical. Any imbalance could amplify the vessel's response to the lake's unforgiving waves. The Fitzgerald's engineers had calculated trim, ballast, and hold distribution with precision, yet experts would later suggest that, Even minor shifts in cargo under stress could magnify the rolling and pitching of the ship. Every ton of iron ore, while stable under normal conditions, became a potential variable when the freighter encountered the storm that would ultimately define its disappearance. The careful management of cargo, so routine in ordinary circumstances, now formed a silent prelude to the challenges that lay ahead. Meteorological records of the Great Lakes note that sudden November storms could form within hours, creating towering waves and fierce wind gusts that caught even experienced crews off guard. SS Edmund Fitzgerald's instruments recorded rapid barometric drops, yet such data could never fully predict the unpredictable interactions between wind, wave, and hull. Maritime historians have noted that the lake's shallow underwater topography often amplified wave height in localized areas, meaning that even a well-ballasted freighter could encounter waves far larger than anticipated. Understanding these dynamics sheds light on how the Fitzgerald, despite careful loading and professional seamanship, faced conditions that could overwhelm its stability in an instant. Clouds thickened and winds intensified as the storm progressed, and the crew observed the horizon darken, with a mix of caution and professional focus. The waves began to climb unpredictably, striking the Fitzgerald with increasing force, while temperatures fell sharply and visibility decreased. Bridge officers noted the barometric pressure dropping and the wind direction shifting, all indicators of a storm growing in both intensity and ferocity. The lake's surface, once calm under the morning sun, now rippled with the first hints of the chaos to come, demanding every ounce of the crew's attention and skill. During the heightening tempest, Captain Ernest McSorley radioed to the nearest vessel, "We are holding our own." These final words, calm and resolute, were transmitted with the professional clarity of a captain reporting routine conditions even as the storm swelled around him. The phrase conveyed confidence, yet beneath the tone lay a subtle acknowledgement of rising waves, the strain on the vessel, and the limits of human control in the face of Lake Superior's raw power. This brief communication would become the only voice to emerge from the Fitzgerald before all other signals fell silent, a haunting marker of its final known position. Bridge officers monitored the ship's response to each swell, making subtle adjustments while the engines laboured under increasing pressure, the lake's fury unrelenting. The freighter rolled and pitched, each movement measured against the calculations of ballast and cargo weight. Crewmen relayed updates to one another, checking for leaks, assessing hatch integrity, and confirming engine performance. The bridge was a hub of calm, professional vigilance, but every action was shadowed by the knowledge that the storm could, at any moment, surpass even their best efforts. Moments after the last transmission, SS Edmund Fitzgerald vanished from radar and radio, leaving only silence where confident voices had just spoken. Instruments ceased reporting, and the vigilant monitoring by nearby vessels revealed no distress signals, no mayday calls, nothing to indicate the precise moment of disaster. The ship's disappearance was instantaneous in its finality, leaving the lake itself as the sole witness to the freighter's fate. Search crews scoured the storm-tossed waters in the days that followed, recovering fragmented debris but no survivors, the lake itself holding tight to its secrets. Lifeboats, life jackets, and scattered pieces of cargo drifted aimlessly, bearing silent testimony to the ship's sudden loss. Investigators documented the wreckage patterns, water conditions, and weather reports, piecing together a narrative that hinted at the storm's overwhelming force but stopped short of full explanation. Each recovered fragment deepened the mystery, illustrating both the magnitude of the vessel and the inconsolable void left in its absence. Analysts examined structural design, cargo load, and wave patterns, but no single explanation fully accounted for the freighter's sudden loss, leaving unanswered questions that continue to intrigue maritime historians. Studies suggested that rogue waves, structural stress, or cargo instability could have contributed, yet the precise chain of events remains speculative. The Fitzgerald's disappearance continues to challenge understanding, a blend of engineering, human decision-making, and the unquantifiable power of nature, a puzzle encoded in fragments of wreckage and the memory of its last words. The voice of SS Edmund Fitzgerald, calm and professional in its final words, echoes across Lake Superior only as a memory of what vanished without a trace. The unfinished log of Mary Celeste. The Mary Celeste drifted through the Atlantic like a ghostly silhouette, her decks orderly yet completely devoid of human presence. She had departed from New York carrying a cargo of denatured alcohol bound for Genoa, and while the weather was mild when she set sail, the open ocean held a quiet that seemed to swallow the ship whole. Sailors aboard other vessels would later describe her as appearing in perfect seaworthy condition, yet no life stirred on her decks, no cries echoed from below, and no explanation for the absence of her crew would ever be found. The ship itself became a haunting focal point, a vessel caught between normal maritime routine and an enduring mystery. Before her final voyage, the brigantine had earned a reputation for reliability, carrying cargo along established trade routes under experienced captains. Constructed in 1861 in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, Mary Celeste was well built with a stout hull and a simple rig that made her both nimble and capable of enduring heavy seas. Her previous voyages had all been completed without notable incident, and her crew was regarded as competent and disciplined. Captain Benjamin Briggs had sailed extensively along the Atlantic routes, commanding vessels with a reputation for efficiency and discipline. His knowledge of prevailing currents, seasonal wind patterns, and port procedures reflected years of experience, while the crew, ranging from seasoned sailors to younger deckhands, operated within a hierarchy that left little room for error. Records from the ship's departure show a crew attentive to daily duties, logging wind direction, speed, and navigational bearings with routine precision. Captain Briggs, along with his wife, daughter, and 7 crew members, had conducted thorough inspections of the cargo hold and rigging, ensuring that the barrels of alcohol were secured and that the ship was seaworthy. Routine checks were conducted on ballast and bilge levels, as well as the integrity of the sails and rigging. Nothing in these initial days suggested any unusual conditions or any hint that disaster might strike. Charts and meteorological notes suggest that the waters she traversed were calm for most of the journey, with only sporadic swells and variable winds to challenge navigation. Historical weather reconstructions indicate that the Atlantic along her route experienced typical November patterns, including occasional fog banks and shifting breezes, yet nothing extraordinary that might explain the crew's sudden disappearance. Though calm for much of her journey, the Atlantic could shift quickly, and subtle changes in wind and current may have played a role in creating a precarious environment for the ship. Fog sometimes descended without warning, limiting visibility to mere yards, while localized swells could rock even the sturdiest freighter. Within the cabin, the ship's log remained a silent witness, its pages ending abruptly, leaving no final words, only the meticulous entries of ordinary seafaring life. Captain Briggs recorded daily observations regarding wind speed, bearing, and the ship's course. Provisions, weather conditions, and cargo inspections were noted in the standard, precise language of a disciplined mariner. Yet the log offered no clue of tension, fear, or sudden danger. It ended as suddenly as the mystery itself. A book closed in the midst of routine observation, leaving historians to grapple with the fact that there were no recorded last words from those aboard. When another vessel found the Mary Celeste, her sails hung slack, cargo untouched, and no signal of distress had ever been sent. The DEI Gratia, a passing brig, spotted her drifting near the Azores, appearing seaworthy and intact. As the DI Gratia drew closer, observers noted the perfectly set sails and the glint of sunlight on the ship's hull, yet no figures appeared on deck. The brig's crew cautiously boarded the Mary Celeste, expecting some sign of activity or distress, only to find the cabins orderly, charts on the table, and provisions untouched. Every detail suggested that life had simply vanished, leaving a seaworthy vessel suspended in a state of suspended normalcy that defied explanation. Investigators noted the hull's integrity and equipment functionality, revealing a ship fully capable of continuing its voyage, yet abandoned under inexplicable circumstances. The rigging, sails, and pumps all functioned as expected. The alcohol cargo was secure, with only minor leakage noted from a few barrels, not enough to justify evacuation. Contemporary forensic accounts highlight that nothing in the ship's condition could explain the crew's disappearance, no evidence of struggle or fire, and no indication that foul play had occurred. Every technical assessment reinforced the enigma, a ship built to endure the ocean left entirely alone. Maritime historians catalogued explanations ranging from sudden storms to structural anomalies, but none could definitively account for the crew's disappearance. Piracy was considered unlikely, as nothing was stolen. Mutiny was inconsistent with the character of Captain Briggs and his crew. Alcohol fumes igniting in the hold could have been catastrophic, but would have left more obvious signs of damage. The lack of a final communication or distress signal remained central to the enduring mystery. The story of the Mary Celeste reverberated through maritime lore, inspiring speculation, literature, and cautionary tales for generations of sailors. Newspapers of the period recounted the discovery with a mixture of awe and fear, emphasizing the impossibility of a crew disappearing from a perfectly sound vessel. The ship became a symbol of the ocean's capacity to harbour secrets, and its story has been referenced in novels, poems, and scholarly studies examining maritime anomalies. Each retelling emphasized the log's abrupt end, the untouched cargo, and the eerie normalcy of a ship that should have been carrying life across the Atlantic. Once filled with neatly stacked barrels, the Mary Celeste's hold became a focal point for theorists. Some suggested that alcohol fumes might have forced the crew to take to lifeboats unnecessarily, though the calm seas at the time made such panic improbable. The ship's galley, cabins, and storage areas showed no signs of struggle, and personal belongings were left behind, intensifying the air of mystery. The absence of any lifeboat deployment further deepened questions about what could compel an experienced crew to vanish entirely. The log remains unfinished, the crew never returned, and the Mary Celeste drifts eternally in memory as a vessel whose silence speaks louder than any recorded word. The final Morse pulse of SS Waratah. Signals flickered across distant wireless stations as the SS Waratah moved steadily along her scheduled route, each dot and dash a small reassurance that the ship continued on its voyage. Operators at remote posts tracked her transmissions with methodical attention, recording positions and routine acknowledgements that, at the time, carried little sense of urgency. Passengers on board experienced the voyage as ordinary, their days filled with the quiet rhythms of travel while below deck. Cargo was stowed and secured with the precision expected of a vessel navigating open and often unpredictable southern waters. Engineers and builders had crafted Waratah to carry passengers and cargo with both speed and stability, her design reflecting the pinnacle of maritime technology in the early 20th century. The ship's steel hull, reinforced at stress points and fitted with watertight bulkheads, was intended to withstand turbulent conditions encountered along the South African coast and into the open Indian Ocean. Her twin engines and twin-screw configuration provided redundancy that allowed steady progress even under mechanical strain, and her upper decks balanced passenger comfort with clear sightlines for navigation. A skilled crew managed the vessel's daily operations, following established procedures for navigation, cargo handling, and communications that had ensured safe passage on prior voyages. Officers monitored charts with care, plotted positions with precision, and verified the weight and balance of cargo holds. Deckhands and engineers maintained engines and hull integrity, while radio operators maintained a steady rhythm of Morse transmissions. Wireless stations along the southern Indian trade routes monitored every transmission, receiving reports in the form of Morse code that confirmed position, speed, and status with mechanical precision. Each communication was brief and procedural, the ship's latitude and longitude, headings, wind conditions, and occasional acknowledgement of messages received. Though entirely routine, these transmissions now stand as the Waratah's last words, the final trace of a ship that would vanish without warning. They were exercises in connection, a lifeline for coordination with ports and other vessels. The operators on land relied on this network to anticipate arrivals, track cargo, and maintain schedules across thousands of miles of open water. Their work both mundane and essential, an invisible web linking ship and shore. Amid this network of observation, a single brief Morse signal emerged as the Waratah's last known communication, an unremarkable set of dots and dashes whose sudden cessation would become the first sign of a vanishing ship. The content of this final pulse offered no warning, no distress, merely the mechanical confirmation that all was proceeding normally. Yet, with the benefit of hindsight, the routine nature of the signal carries a chilling weight. It was the final trace of the ship, a heartbeat of Morse code that faded into silence, leaving nothing to mark the vessel's location or fate beyond its departure from monitored transmissions. Currents shifted subtly beneath the Waratah's hull, while seasonal winds and swells offered no immediate threat, presenting a normal seascape for a vessel built to withstand much harsher conditions. Oceanographic reports from the time indicate steady, moderate patterns of wave and wind along her intended path, conditions that, in theory, should not have posed unusual risk to a fully operational liner of her class. Yet the vast expanse of the South Indian Ocean, remote and largely unpatrolled, concealed the ship as effectively as it concealed any potential hazard. The interplay of currents and weather created an environment in which a large vessel could disappear entirely, leaving no floating debris and no signals beyond those already received. When the ship failed to respond to subsequent stations, search vessels and nearby ports mobilised, scanning thousands of square miles of water where the Waratah had last been recorded. Coordinated efforts spanned multiple nations, with naval and commercial assets combing shipping lanes for evidence of the vessel or its cargo. Despite these measures, searchers found only fragments of routine data, schedules of anticipated arrival, log entries confirming departure, and the final Morse transmission, now silent. Each hour that passed without contact intensified concern, and the disappearance began to enter public consciousness as both a technical puzzle and a human tragedy. Post-voyage analyses focused on the vessel's structural integrity, engine logs, and maintenance records, all of which suggested that nothing in her design or recent performance could explain her disappearance. Reports indicated that the ship had undergone standard inspections, and that crew reports before her final transmission noted no mechanical issues beyond typical maintenance. Engineers examined blueprints for potential weaknesses, while investigators evaluated environmental data for hazards such as rogue waves, underwater obstructions, or sudden storms. Aboard the ship, a mix of passengers and valuable cargo was carried, and manifests revealed nothing extraordinary, adding to the unsettling reality that life and property had simply vanished without warning. Records show standard allocation of cabins and holds, routine distribution of provisions, and no anomalies in passenger manifests. In reports by maritime authorities and newspapers, the disappearance was chronicled with a mix of fascination and dread, generating speculation that persisted for decades as the ship remained unrecovered. Letters to shipping companies, reports from international offices, and news articles captured the mystery in both technical and narrative terms, offering theories without resolution. Some historians and seafarers suggested environmental forces or mechanical failure, while others recognised that the silence itself was the most troubling phenomenon. A ship could disappear entirely in the age of wireless monitoring, leaving only the faint memory of a Morse pulse to testify to its passage. No matter the effort, the Waratah's fate remains unresolved, her final Morse pulse echoing as a stark reminder of the ocean's capacity to erase vessels and lives with total silence. The pulse represents more than a lost ship. It is a monument to uncertainty, a fleeting proof of existence that vanished as soon as it was acknowledged, leaving only questions and the vast emptiness in which they float. A solitary pulse of Morse code lingers in history, the only testament to a ship that vanished without a trace, suspended forever between presence and oblivion. The last deck report of USS Cyclops. The Cyclops hummed with the steady rhythm of machinery and the footsteps of crew moving across steel decks, its vast holds brimming with coal, every detail of the ship's operation under meticulous watch. Officers moved deliberately between hatches and railings, observing the ship's structural integrity, while noting the precise alignment of cargo and the mechanical efficiency of the engines below. This enormous collier, one of the Navy's largest, was built for endurance, a vessel designed to carry immense weight across long stretches of the Atlantic. Its massive presence projected confidence, yet even the most formidable engineering could not make it immune to the subtle dangers that waited in the unseen currents of mid-ocean passage. Morning inspections were routine but exhaustive. Officers checked each coal hatch, ensuring lids were sealed and chains were properly tensioned. Winches and pulleys were examined with practiced eyes, their maintenance logs annotated with the exact time and condition of every moving part. These procedures, so ordinary in appearance, reflected the discipline and vigilance demanded of a ship whose cargo was both heavy and vital to war-era supply lines. Crew members followed patterns honed over voyages, moving efficiently but unaware that these ordinary exercises would become the final record of their diligence. From the bridge, the captain and his officers plotted headings with precision, consulting charts marked with careful measurements of currents, trade routes, and projected weather. Navigating a fully loaded collier required constant attention to even minor shifts in position, especially as seasonal winds and currents across the western Atlantic could affect the ship's trajectory. The Cyclops relied on dead reckoning, compasses and chronometers. Its crew was experienced in correcting for variations and anomalies, yet these instruments, precise as they were, could not anticipate the unforeseen forces that would ultimately intervene. The ship sent a final deck report confirming position, coal levels, course, and prevailing wind conditions. In tone, it was methodical, calm, and entirely procedural, offering no forewarning of the fate that would soon claim the Cyclops. This communication, transmitted across the Navy's networks, became the last official words of the vessel, a testament to routine order and the illusion of security even as the unknown waited just beyond reach. Every entry reflected precision, the careful stewardship of men who followed duty above speculation, their ordinary words now haunting in retrospect. Below decks, engineers tended the engines with unwavering attention. Pressure gauges, steam valves, and lubrication points were monitored continuously, the sound of pistons and turbines forming a constant backdrop to the monotony of maintenance. The contrast between human control and natural unpredictability was stark. While crew labour maintained the vessel's functionality, they remained powerless against invisible hazards like sudden shifts in cargo or undetected stress fractures within the hull. Every turn of a wrench, every measured adjustment, became a silent chronicle of their commitment to duty. Deck officers recorded observations of weather, sea state, and cargo security, their logs filled with entries reflecting diligence rather than drama. Each notation, written in steady script, became a fragment of history, the last written testament of a ship that would vanish without warning. The repetition of checks, inspections, and communication formed a rhythm of normalcy, yet, in retrospect, these ordinary acts gain a spectral significance, a prelude to the abrupt cessation of all activity. The final deck report, methodical and exact, remains an enduring symbol of preparation that could not forestall disappearance. Even with careful procedures, the Cyclops' design carried inherent vulnerabilities. The hull, compartmentalized yet carrying the immense weight of coal, was subject to gradual stress from both cargo and ocean swells. Naval analysts later considered how hidden fissures, reinforced steel under constant tension, and concentrated weight could interact with unusual wave patterns to create catastrophic failure. Such structural risks were invisible to those aboard, and the crew's routine diligence, impressive as it was, could not compensate for the sudden and unpredictable pressures exerted by the ocean. Cargo inspections extended beyond mere safety checks, revealing a hidden complexity in how the Cyclops balanced weight across its massive hull. Officers meticulously monitored the distribution of coal, aware that uneven loads could strain bulkheads or shift dangerously during rough seas. Calculations were made to account for tide, swell, and the ship's centre of gravity, a practice that demanded both experience and constant attention. The vessel's enormous coal bunkers required regular redistribution, a laborious process that consumed hours of crew time yet ensured that the Cyclops sailed as level and stable as possible. Even minor oversights in this process could be magnified under the forces of the Atlantic, illustrating the delicate balance between human diligence and the unpredictable power of the ocean. In retrospect, these routine adjustments underscore the precision of the crew's labour and the invisible challenges faced by a ship that ultimately vanished without warning. The crew itself was experienced and disciplined, each man understanding his role within a hierarchical system that ensured operational efficiency. Officers supervised inspections, stewards maintained decks, and engineers monitored engines. A synchronized choreography developed through repetition and training. Their labour was measured, meticulous, and confident in the vessel's capacity, a human element that lent stability to what appeared to be a predictable routine. Yet this certainty, built upon experience and procedure, became tragically ironic in light of the ship's vanishing, emphasizing the limitations of foresight in the face of unseen forces. When the Cyclops failed to arrive at its destination, search operations extended across hundreds of miles, involving multiple ships and reconnaissance efforts. Despite the scale of the response, no wreckage, lifeboat, or personal effects were ever recovered. The absence of physical evidence created a vacuum in which speculation and investigation persisted for decades, from naval analysts scrutinizing structural vulnerabilities to historians tracing possible currents and weather anomalies. Each theory emphasized the scale of uncertainty surrounding a vessel whose disappearance defied conventional explanation. Naval historians have since catalogued the Cyclops alongside other enigmatic maritime disappearances, a case study in how even the most disciplined operations and modern communications can fail to prevent tragedy. Reports from the period highlighted weather patterns, including occasional squalls and shifting Atlantic currents, and structural theories based on similar colliers experiencing hull failures. Yet the sheer lack of tangible evidence preserved the mystery, leaving the final deck report as the sole anchor of certainty in an otherwise speculative narrative. The methodical precision of the last communication stands out in stark contrast to the chaotic absence that followed. Even today, the calm, procedural final deck report of the Cyclops stands as a solitary human trace upon a vast and indifferent ocean, a signal swallowed by the unknown. The final weather query of MV Neils Clausen. Mariners relied on constant updates from the Atlantic Weather Network, each query a thread connecting ship to shore. The MV Neils Clausen, a sturdy cargo vessel traversing the North Atlantic, moved under the watchful eyes of officers accustomed to the rhythm of transoceanic crossings. Bridge routines dictated that weather conditions be monitored and communicated without fail, a lifeline linking the isolated ship to coastal stations and other vessels along its route. These updates, though often mundane in content, carried the weight of safety and situational awareness across vast, empty expanses where the slightest miscalculation could prove fatal. Each morning, the captain and officers would review barometric readings, wind direction, and wave height, noting deviations that could signal approaching storms or shifts in the currents. The bridge crew moved with practiced precision, measuring, recording, and reporting conditions that could determine the safety of their crossing. Observers scanned the horizon for signs of approaching squalls, while the helmsman maintained the ship's heading, ensuring that course corrections were made smoothly to preserve stability. Radio operators stood at the ready, logs in hand, prepared to transmit the routine inquiries and replies that had become the vessel's heartbeat. Even under seemingly calm conditions, each step was deliberate, a testament to the maritime culture that prized both vigilance and adherence to procedure. The North Atlantic, with its sudden swells and unpredictable storms, required constant attention, and the crew of the Neils Clausen understood that even ordinary weather reports could mean the difference between security and disaster. The vessel's last recorded query, a simple request for wind readings, slipped into the ether without any acknowledgement, a final echo of disciplined routine. There were no last words from the captain or crew beyond this procedural message. Its brevity contrasted with the anxiety it would later evoke, the ordinary nature of the question taking on a haunting quality after all subsequent communication ceased. Stations along the trade routes monitored the query as they had done countless times before, yet no reply was ever received. In that silence, the procedural became mysterious, and the ordinary pulse of maritime routine became the final trace of a ship and its crew. Above the ocean, clouds gathered into formations known to experienced sailors as harbingers of sudden storms, shifting the horizon from calm to peril in minutes. The wind, previously steady, began to fluctuate, twisting in unpredictable eddies that tugged at rigging and disrupted surface patterns. Currents, usually predictable along the Neils Clausen's route, showed subtle but critical variations, their strength amplified by an unseen storm brewing to the west. The vessel itself, a reliable cargo ship built for endurance, now faced a volatile environment where small changes in atmospheric pressure could cascade into serious hazards. Yet, no indication of imminent danger had appeared on the bridge, and the crew remained unaware that the ship's last message had already been dispatched. Engineers and officers were intimately aware of the ship's operational limits, constantly weighing speed, load, and stability against the mutable forces of wind and wave. Heavy cargo, stowed and secured according to protocol, offered both ballast and risk. In shifting conditions, even the most disciplined loading could create unforeseen instability. Machinery hummed in the background, maintained meticulously but always vulnerable to the extremes of the North Atlantic. Every adjustment of engine output or rudder angle was calculated, yet the crew could not foresee what the ocean might demand in the hours following their last inquiry. The vessel's systems, robust yet finite, were a reminder that even seasoned mariners were subject to the ocean's whims. When the expected reply never arrived, radio stations noted the silence, A growing alarm traced across maps and logs, yet no sign of the vessel appeared. Operators attempted repeated contact, first with routine check-ins and then with escalating urgency, but the Atlantic offered nothing in response. No other vessels reported a sighting, no debris drifted into established shipping lanes, and coastal authorities found no trace of the Neils Clausen in its projected path. The abrupt absence was an anomaly that puzzled even experienced controllers, turning what had been a routine weather check into a historical enigma. The network of maritime communication, normally a reliable web linking ship and shore, now offered only unanswered gaps. In the wake of its disappearance, investigations sought to understand what might have befallen the vessel in the critical hours after the last transmission. Meteorological records suggested storm activity could have intersected with the ship's position, yet no evidence confirmed the timing or severity. Currents and tides might have carried debris far from the projected location, and while the Neils Clausen was structurally sound, no ship is impervious to the unexpected confluence of environmental pressures. Every hypothesis remained tempered by the absence of physical evidence, leaving the story incomplete. Historians, mariners, and investigators could only reconstruct the voyage through routine logs, weather charts, and accounts of the final inquiry sent into the void. The absence of further communication rendered every detail of the last query eerily consequential, as though the mundane message itself had become the vessel's final signature. A simple question about wind, posed out of habit and diligence, transformed into the last human mark upon a vast, indifferent ocean. It symbolized both connection and loss, a reminder of the fragile interface between routine and catastrophe. The Neils Clausen's disappearance would later serve as a case study in maritime caution, illustrating how even the smallest lapse in situational awareness, or the sudden onset of natural forces, can erase a vessel without warning. The ordinary in this case became extraordinary in its finality. In reflecting on the vanished ship, the discipline and professionalism of its crew emerge with poignant clarity. Each procedural step they followed, each observation and report represents centuries of maritime knowledge applied to the uncertain North Atlantic. Yet, the very systems designed to safeguard the voyage, weather monitoring, routine communication, mechanical reliability, proved powerless against the unknown variables that claimed the vessel. The Neils Clausen, like so many before and after it, reminds those who study the seas that, even in an age of technology and procedure, the ocean retains dominion, and its mysteries endure beyond explanation. And so the MV Neils Clausen, after one final question about the wind, vanished into the vast Atlantic, leaving only silence where certainty had once prevailed. The radio fade-out of MV Gaul, amid the regulated schedules and disciplined routines of the Barents Sea fishing fleet, MV Gaul carried out its duties with quiet efficiency, its crew attuned to the subtle signals of machinery, wind, and ice. The trawler, a stalwart vessel designed for the harsh northern waters, moved under grey skies that blurred the horizon, blending sea and air into a continuous expanse of steel grey. Conditions in this remote region were unforgiving. Swirling ice flows, sudden gusts, and unpredictable currents demanded constant attention, and even routine operations could turn perilous in moments. Despite its sturdy construction and experienced crew, MV Gaul was bound to the rules of nature, subject to forces that could overwhelm preparation and foresight alike. Every morning, radio operators transmitted brief, precise messages to coastal stations, confirming position, acknowledging instructions, and reporting on the day's planned operations. These signals formed an invisible web across the Arctic waters, linking isolated vessels to the safety net of shore-based monitoring and maritime coordination. The crew depended on this routine as much as the shore stations did, a ritual that both grounded their day and reassured those who relied on timely arrivals and accurate updates. Such communications, though procedural, represented a lifeline. They documented the passage of a ship in a vast and treacherous expanse, each report a small proof of life against the enormity of the sea. Ice flows drifted unpredictably beneath the hull, shifting with wind and tide, while gusts carried salt and snow in stinging sheets, a reminder that this was a landscape both beautiful and merciless. The Barents Sea offered little in the way of shelter, with open water stretching to distant horizons and sudden storms capable of altering conditions within minutes. Crew members scanned the horizon constantly, eyes trained for any movement in the grey expanse that might indicate a hazard or the presence of fellow vessels. Navigational charts recorded currents, ice movement, and historical storm patterns, but the reality of the sea remained volatile, its threats immediate and uncompromising. Below deck, the crew checked lines, nets, and engines with methodical precision. Every knot tightened, and gear inspected reflected the professionalism of men accustomed to the harsh northern waters. Even with experience and careful procedure, the tension of operating under such conditions was ever present. Small incidents, jammed nets, engine fluctuations, shifting cargo, could ripple outward into dangerous situations if left unchecked. The monotony of routine concealed a latent awareness that one wrong calculation could be disastrous. A truth the crew understood and respected silently with every check, every log entry, every glance toward the dim horizon. During what would become the vessel's last contact, a routine radio check reported course, speed, and weather conditions, transmitted in the concise and formal language customary to these exchanges. The message, like countless others before it, confirmed position and noted ice and wind conditions, without revealing any hint of unusual difficulty. Then, gradually, the signal slipped into static, cutting off the connection that had bridged the isolation of sea and shore. Operators on land were left with no further communication, only the faint residue of the Morse pulses that had documented the ship's status moments earlier. In that silence, the ordinary rhythms of maritime life were suspended, leaving the ship's fate unknown and the human presence on board reduced to absence. When the vessel failed to reach port as expected, search teams immediately examined shipping lanes, currents, and historical ice patterns. Helicopters, ships, and aircraft scoured the known routes, mapping drift models and scanning the frozen sea for any sign of wreckage or survivors. Despite meticulous planning and extensive coverage, no trace was found. The ship's disappearance remained absolute. There were no distress calls, no recovered debris that could indicate a cause, no witness testimony from other vessels. In the extreme cold of the Barents Sea, the absence of evidence became as notable as any positive finding, a silence that seemed to echo the vanished Morse code. Technical records and environmental data were later analysed by maritime historians and safety experts, considering sudden squalls, shifting ice, or mechanical failure as plausible factors. The ship's construction, crew experience, and adherence to protocol provided few clues, complicating any attempt at a definitive explanation. Researchers also examined weather logs and satellite imagery from the period, reconstructing likely scenarios but always encountering gaps that could not be bridged. The mystery was compounded by the vessel's solitary course, far from shipping lanes frequented by other traffic, and the absence of eyewitness accounts made conjecture the only tool to approach understanding. The disappearance of MV Gaul highlighted vulnerabilities inherent in Arctic maritime operations. Investigations prompted a reassessment of monitoring procedures, emphasizing the need for redundant communication systems and continuous tracking in regions where routine checks could be the only indication of life at sea. Maritime agencies implemented stricter protocols for ice reporting, emergency signaling, and radio redundancy, ensuring that no vessel could vanish completely without leaving at least a trace. While these measures enhanced safety for future operations, the fate of the Gaul remained an unsolved reminder of how quickly routine procedures could end in disappearance. In examining the human dimension, researchers noted the psychological weight of operating in isolation, with crews conditioned to endure discomfort, monotony, and the ever-present threat of sudden disaster. Logs recorded meticulous attention to mechanical details, weather, and ice conditions, yet they also captured an atmosphere of quiet professionalism that masked underlying tension. The absence of further communication underscored how reliance on routine could become an unintentional vulnerability, leaving even the most disciplined crews exposed to unpredictable forces. Ice drift studies later suggested that if the ship had encountered a sudden flow collision or mechanical failure, the forces could have overwhelmed the vessel in moments. Currents in the Barents Sea moved swiftly beneath surface ice, and a compromised hull or loss of power might have left the ship unable to maneuver. Analysis of historical weather data indicated strong gusts and low temperatures that could have exacerbated any minor failure, rendering it catastrophic. Yet none of these assessments could produce certainty. The ship had disappeared entirely, leaving only the silent trail of the last Morse transmissions. Even today, The vanished signal of MV Gaul serves as a stark testament to the unpredictability of northern seas. Though modern technology allows near-constant tracking and satellite communication, the story of the trawler reminds mariners and historians alike that every routine transmission represents a fragile tether to safety. The faint echo of those final Morse pulses, now studied and preserved in maritime archives, resonates with the human struggle to navigate environments both majestic and unforgiving, underscoring the thin line between ordinary operations and disappearance. The faint echo of a signal lost to static remains the only testimony of a ship that vanished without warning, its fate still suspended in the frozen expanse of the Barents Sea. The last course correction of SS Poet. A gentle wind moved across the mid-Atlantic shipping lanes as a fully loaded cargo vessel pushed steadily through the dark water. The ship's routine movements hid no sign of trouble, no early tremor of danger, nothing to hint that the voyage would become one of the most unsettling disappearances in modern maritime history. It was only after the SS Poet vanished that attention returned to the final, composed message about adjusting course toward Gibraltar, simple notes about course, weather, and timing that became the last verifiable fragments of a crew that would never be heard from again. There was nothing unusual about the SS Poet's departure from Philadelphia as it sailed toward Port Said, its holds carrying a heavy load of corn destined for Egypt, a route it had taken before. Reports later emphasized how ordinary the early hours of the voyage appeared, with the vessel moving southeast along the coast before shaping an expected path toward Gibraltar, a waypoint commonly noted in transmissions as crews updated their progress through familiar waters. The final course adjustment referenced in the ship's last routine communication mentioned this eastbound track, yet this message would soon take on an eerie gravity as the last confirmed trace of the vessel's existence. Official documents held by the United States Coast Guard noted that the ship's last radio contact had been calm and procedural, the kind of transmission that marked nothing more than a standard check among thousands made across the Atlantic every year. The Poet's officers reported steady winds, moderate seas, and no mechanical concerns, conditions that gave investigators little to work with when the vessel failed to reappear on any shipping schedule or radar sweep. That absence of a clear threat deepened the mystery and left the final course report as a haunting reminder that the crew believed their journey remained safe. Freight vessels of the Poet's size were expected to maintain regular communication intervals, especially during international voyages involving fully loaded cargo and long oceanic crossings. The silence that followed the final transmission stood out sharply against these expectations, prompting naval authorities to question whether the ship had suffered a sudden structural failure or a rapid flooding event that left no time for distress calls. Investigators found no record of critical defects, though analysts considered whether age might compromise the hull. The lack of recovered debris or oil slicks kept all assumptions in the realm of speculation, leaving only the factual record that the Poet had communicated its course and then disappeared without another word. The families of the missing crew members later described the devastating uncertainty that surrounded the investigation, noting how the absence of a final plea or warning felt more unsettling than if a distress transmission had been captured. Yet the Poet's disappearance occurred in an era when shipping routes were densely trafficked and radio communication was reliable enough that a total loss without a single distress call remained highly unusual. Reports from the Coast Guard detailed the extensive search that followed, an operation that covered thousands of miles in an attempt to locate any sign of the missing vessel. Aircraft scanned grid after grid of open sea, and nearby ships altered their headings to sweep areas where analysts believed the Poet could have drifted or sunk. The effort continued far beyond typical search durations, due to the ship's size and the absence of any physical evidence, yet nothing surfaced. The silence remained undisturbed, reinforcing the unsettling truth that the vessel had seemingly vanished into the deep without leaving so much as a floating fragment. In examining the ship's construction, experts noted that the Poet had been built during the Second World War as a modified Liberty-type vessel, a fact that introduced questions about material fatigue and the durability of older hulls under heavy loads. The possibility remained unresolved, particularly because sudden breaks in older steel hulls had occurred in other cases, though none precisely mirrored the Poet's route or circumstances. The inability to match the ship's disappearance to a known pattern added another layer of complexity to an already perplexing case. Weather analysts reviewed satellite data to evaluate the influence of the system forming in the Atlantic at the time of the disappearance, observing that the storm's intensity increased as it moved across the region. These findings suggested that the poet might have encountered rougher conditions than initially reported, yet the ship's last communication mentioned only manageable seas. Without any recovered instruments or structural remnants, investigators could not determine whether the storm had reached the vessel with greater force than expected. The uncertainty surrounding the weather's role exemplified the challenge of reconstructing events when every tangible clue had been swallowed by the ocean. Scholars of maritime mysteries often return to the significance of the ship's final course correction, noting how its routine tone made the subsequent silence more chilling. Unlike vessels that broadcast distress calls or fragmented transmissions in their final moments, the poet's last communication reflected steady confidence, as though the voyage would continue without interruption. The matter-of-fact acknowledgement of its eastbound track toward Gibraltar became a symbol of the broader enigma, a factual anchor in a narrative defined entirely by absence. The search logs preserved by the Coast Guard detail the meticulous efforts made to identify even the smallest trace that could have shed light on the vessel's fate. Rescue teams noted that despite sweeping vast expanses of the Atlantic, they found no lifeboats, no floating cargo, and no personal effects that could be tied to the poet. The silence of the sea became the most defining feature of the ship's disappearance, a quiet that held onto every answer investigators sought. Years after the incident, maritime analysts continued to debate the most plausible explanations, yet none could claim certainty. The poet remained listed among lost ships whose final hours were never reconstructed, and its last course correction persisted as an unsettling document of a voyage that ended without warning and without evidence. Each detail of the final message, grounded in routine navigation procedures, only emphasized the abrupt and unexplained severing of communication that followed. Out beyond the limits of its last charted path, the sea absorbed the ship and its unanswered story. The final message from SS Kotapaxi. Far out along the corridor where winter winds collided with warm Caribbean air, the first signs of an unsettled atmosphere gathered into towering masses of cloud that signalled a difficult passage ahead. Swells rolled in uneven patterns as air pressure shifted along the Florida-Cuba route, a region known for sudden changes that could transform a routine voyage into a hazardous struggle against wind and sea. Yet, the final communications would reveal that the veneer of routine had already begun to fracture, hinting at instability that would claim the vessel without warning. Metal plates that had already endured years of strain formed the aging framework of the steamship, a vessel whose design reflected another era's demands, rather than the tempests rising along its path. Built in 1918 as a tramp steamer, the Kotapaxi carried heavy loads across varied routes, including the coal it now transported from Charleston to Havana under a routine commercial assignment. The vessel's compartments, pumps and ventilation systems functioned within expected limits, yet even well-maintained machinery faced difficulties when confronted with powerful seas and the additional weight of saturated cargo. The Kotapaxi sailed onward despite these inherent vulnerabilities, moving directly into a confluence of conditions that would test every part of its structure. Southward from Charleston, the sea gradually lost its calm, and the ship pushed onward into waters where shifting weather systems altered the horizon in swift, unpredictable movements. Meteorological analyses conducted long after the disappearance indicate that a strong cold front was advancing across the southeastern United States. At the same time, moist air from the Caribbean intensified the developing storm. Crews aboard other vessels in the region later reported steep waves and rising winds, conditions capable of battering ships that entered the corridor unprepared for its sudden escalation. The stage was set for a confrontation between vessel and storm that unfolded rapidly and left little time for a measured response. What pierced the storm's building roar was a distressed radio transmission reporting heavy flooding and a dangerous list aboard the SS Kotapaxi, a message that reached coastal stations with unmistakable urgency. The content of that final call referenced water entering the holds and pumps unable to keep up with the influx, a scenario that signalled structural compromise and placed the vessel in imminent jeopardy. The call ended abruptly, leaving no indication of whether further attempts were made to broadcast. That single definitive communication became the last documented contact with the ship and formed the foundation of every investigation that followed. Engineers who later examined the incident drew attention to the vulnerabilities that coal-laden ships faced when confronted with penetrating waves and compromised hatches. Coal cargoes, when exposed to water, became heavier and more prone to shifting, especially if stored in large open holds that relied on hatch covers to prevent intrusion. Should a hatch lift under pressure from heavy seas, thousands of gallons of water could pour into the hold within minutes, overwhelming pumps not designed for such volume. The Kotapaxi carried a full load, and its last transmission aligned with technical scenarios in which rapidly increasing flooding destabilized the hull before corrective action could be taken. Along the stretch between the Florida coast and Cuba, the sea shaped itself into rapid currents and sudden squalls that had long challenged captains attempting to maintain steady bearings. The Gulf Stream, one of the world's strongest ocean currents, pushed northward along the Florida Straits, creating turbulent conditions when storm winds collided with its flow. Maritime charts of the era noted the region's reputation for swift weather reversals and disorienting waves that could rise and fall with little warning. Ships travelling close to the corridor's central axis sometimes encountered cross-seas that struck from unpredictable angles, undermining stability by forcing hulls into rolling motions difficult to counter in high winds. These environmental characteristics added complexity to the Kotapaxi's final hours and provided investigators with clues regarding how quickly the vessel's condition may have deteriorated. Moments after the distress message ended, the anticipated follow-up never arrived, leaving an abrupt quiet that settled over monitoring stations without explanation. Operators familiar with maritime emergency protocols expected a second transmission, whether to update the ship's position or describe its status, yet no additional call ever came. The silence suggested that the vessel succumbed rapidly to the flooding it reported, possibly within minutes, which aligned with the structural risks presented by hatch failures and compromised holds. That disappearance of voice and signal created the foundation of the mystery, for a vessel that broadcast danger so clearly should not have vanished without leaving a visible trace. Search vessels dispatched into the turbulent straits encountered rolling swells and wide drift zones that thwarted efforts to locate any trace of the missing steamer. Naval and merchant vessels contributed to the search during the following days, sweeping through areas calculated from the last known transmission and projections of how far debris might travel under the existing currents. The Gulf Stream's strength complicated the search by moving waterborne material great distances in short periods, scattering what might have been identifiable remains far beyond the calculated paths. Without debris or survivors, the investigation confronted the limits of maritime recovery along one of the most dynamic stretches of ocean in the Western Hemisphere. Years later, researchers encountered a wreck that some news outlets associated with the Kotapaxi, yet maritime archaeologists approached the claim with the caution such identifications require. The structure found north of Cuba resembled early 20th century freighters and held cargo consistent with coal transport, but experts noted that the region contained multiple shipwrecks from similar periods. Without conclusive artifacts linking the wreck to the Kotapaxi, the identification remained speculative despite its widespread media attention. The persistence of the wreck's uncertain status demonstrated how easily disappearances could accumulate layers of interpretation even when facts remained incomplete. Considerations of the ship's final moments often returned to the human realities of a crew trying to maintain order as water rose beneath their feet and the hull leaned more sharply into the waves. The pressure of coordinating pump operations, adjusting ballast, and securing compromised areas under severe conditions would have demanded rapid action and absolute concentration. Maritime protocols of the time would have required officers to issue commands amid the chaos, while engineers struggled to evaluate damage in dark, flooding compartments. The unfolding crisis placed the crew in a scenario where survival hinged on minutes, not hours, and where the margin for error shrank with every passing wave. Reflections on the vessel's last report often centre on how clearly the situation was described, even as the outcome remained impossible to determine. The Kotapaxi's SOS outlined a condition that maritime authorities recognised as dire, yet the clarity of the message contrasted sharply with the silence that followed. The lack of any subsequent fragments or partial calls pointed to a rapid escalation in the ship's condition, possibly as structural components gave way or machinery failed under the pressure of flooding. The combination of clear communication and total disappearance formed a paradox that shaped every retelling of the ship's fate. Storm pressure increasing against the hull, water surging through breached spaces, and the radio falling silent all converge in the mind as the final tableau preserved by the surviving records. What followed the distress message remains unknown, shaped only by currents, wind, and the depth of the sea where the vessel likely descended beyond the reach of recovery efforts. The Kotapaxi's end, though outlined by factual details, remains suspended in uncertainty, supported by a chain of evidence that stops precisely where the ocean's silence begins. Somewhere beyond the reach of its last distressed words, the Kotapaxi slipped into a silence that no search effort has ever been able to break. The last signal of MV Tungus. A low hum of engines and the rhythmic slap of waves against steel filled the deck as the freighter moved steadily through waters that appeared calm but held hidden turbulence. The ocean surface betrayed little of the forces beneath, yet even in such deceptively ordinary conditions, the crew of the MV Tungus remained attentive, scanning both instruments and horizon as a routine precaution. Within these quiet hours, the ship traced its path along a familiar freight route, its progress recorded in logs and radio check-ins that seemed to reassure operators on shore. Yet, the final communications would reveal that the veneer of routine had already begun to fracture, hinting at instability that would claim the vessel without warning. The MV Tungus, a mid-sized cargo vessel constructed for coastal and transoceanic freight, carried a dense load of industrial goods whose weight demanded careful attention to balance and stowage. Built to transport heavy materials efficiently, its holds were deep and open, relying on proper distribution to maintain stability in open seas. Investigators examining ships of similar design later emphasized how quickly a misaligned load could influence rolling, pitching, and the effectiveness of pumps when water entered unexpectedly. The Tungus's structure, steel-reinforced yet aging, bore the marks of years of service, each rivet and joint a reminder that even sturdy vessels were vulnerable under compounded stress. Navigating the northern route, the crew maintained a constant vigil over both instruments and horizon, noting slight shifts in wind and occasional rolling seas that hinted at potential instability. Maritime officers recorded minor corrections in heading to counter crosscurrents and the occasional swell, and while none indicated an immediate threat, these adjustments reflected the continuous attention required to keep the freighter on course. The ship's engines thrummed steadily, a mechanical heartbeat echoing through the hull, masking the subtle stress experienced by cargo and structure alike. Each turn of the propeller carried not only the vessel forward but also the mounting risk of a system under quiet but relentless strain. Short, fragmented messages began to emerge over the radio, reporting minor but notable shifts in cargo and intermittent malfunctions in the pumps, each transmission fading before it could be fully completed. Operators recorded snippets such as cargo shifting, pump, and then static swallowed the remainder, leaving only partial awareness of the vessel's condition. These fragments offered a window into a rapidly evolving situation, one where minor disturbances in the hold could escalate without notice. Analysts later observed that freighters carrying dense materials were particularly sensitive to sudden weight movement, which could strain pumps and compromise the vessel's stability even in moderate seas. Maritime engineers reviewing similar freighters later observed that uneven weight distribution could induce sudden tilts, particularly when combined with heavy rolling seas, creating conditions where small mechanical failures could escalate rapidly. Steel hulls flexed under repeated stress, and water infiltration in one hold could shift the center of gravity abruptly. Cargo that had seemed stable moments earlier could slide as waves rocked the vessel, producing a cascade of imbalance. While the Tungus's last transmissions did not detail these mechanics explicitly, the fragmentary nature of the signals suggested that crew members were confronting challenges that compounded with each passing moment. Currents moving against the ship's forward momentum added a subtle but significant force to the hull, while localized waves tossed the vessel unpredictably, a combination that magnified the risk posed by shifting loads. The interplay of ocean dynamics with the freighter's design created conditions difficult to model at the time, leaving captains to rely on observation and experience. In the region where Tungus sailed, tidal flows could alter quickly, and sudden gusts occasionally produced cross waves that struck the hull at dangerous angles. Each wave and each shift in current introduced potential for abrupt changes in pitch and list, an invisible hazard that the crew would have felt through trembling decks and swaying cargo. The intermittent transmissions ceased abruptly, leaving only static on the frequency, and investigators later pieced together a final fragmentary report that suggested sudden cargo movement and possible flooding, though its brevity left the scenario incomplete. No distress call followed, and no subsequent reports confirmed whether the vessel regained equilibrium or succumbed rapidly to the forces within. The last moments recorded over the airwaves portrayed a ship struggling silently, a disjointed narrative that hinted at calamity but stopped short of revealing its outcome. For authorities monitoring the frequency, the incomplete signal became a harrowing symbol of uncertainty, an audible record of a disappearance that no search could immediately resolve. Nearby vessels and maritime authorities responded promptly, scanning the surrounding waters, but strong currents and a lack of visible debris hindered any immediate confirmation of the ship's position or condition. Patrols covered miles of open water, adjusting their search patterns to account for drift and wind, yet even extensive sweeps yielded nothing identifiable. The sea itself seemed to absorb every potential clue, dispersing minor traces before they could coalesce into evidence. Operators documented the absence, noting that the region's challenging conditions made rapid recovery nearly impossible, a reality that compounded the mystery surrounding the Tungus. Despite extensive search efforts, nothing of the Tungus was recovered. No floating cargo, no lifeboats, and no oil slicks, allowing the mystery to deepen with every hour that passed without a trace. Analysts later emphasized how unusual such total absences were for freighters of its size, especially given the presence of nearby shipping lanes and patrol routes. The missing vessel became a case study in maritime disappearance, where environmental factors, ship design, and partial communication combined to create a puzzle that resisted resolution. Every day without new information reinforced the unsettling truth that the ship, along with its crew, had vanished almost entirely from observable reality. Historians and analysts later compared the disappearance to other mid-century freighters lost under sudden and fragmented communications, noting that the pattern of incomplete signals often preceded complete vanishing in isolated waters. Reports highlighted the dangers of cargo shift, mechanical stress, and unpredictable sea behaviour, forming a framework for understanding the Tungus's likely final hours without asserting specifics beyond what records verified. This approach allowed scholars to discuss the phenomenon in context, framing the disappearance as part of a broader pattern while maintaining the singular mystery of the vessel itself. The fragmented transmission, brief as it was, became a cautionary illustration of the precarious balance ships of that era maintained between routine voyage and unforeseen disaster. Logs show that crew members would have been engaged in continuous efforts to stabilize the ship, monitoring pumps and braces while responding to shifts in the cargo, though the fragmented transmissions prevent a complete reconstruction of events. Every partial signal points to work underway, adjustments made under duress, and moments of coordination lost to the static and waves. The human element remained present in the documentation, even if it could not be fully reconstructed, leaving only hints of decision-making, tension, and the practical demands of survival aboard a vessel in extremis. The final hours of the Tungus are preserved only in the surviving signals, a disjointed thread that hints at struggle but offers no closure, leaving investigators to contend with the stark absence of certainty. The partial messages themselves have become artifacts, preserved in logs and reports, standing as both evidence and enigma. They suggest movement, urgency, and instability, yet they cannot answer the fundamental question: what finally overcame the freighter and its crew? The MV Tungus spoke in broken fragments, and then, without warning or echo, it disappeared into waters that would reveal nothing of its final movements. The cut transmission of MV Signa. A muted dawn spread over the horizon, painting the Atlantic in shades of grey as the MV Signa pressed steadily on toward its destination. The ship moved with the precise regularity of a freighter, accustomed to long-haul voyages, its engines humming in familiar rhythm, the deck crew attending to standard routines, while the officers checked navigational charts and instruments. No immediate warning betrayed the chaos that would soon claim the vessel, and only later did investigators realise that the last communication from the bridge had become the final trace of a crew who would never be heard from again. Constructed for long-range cargo transport, the Signa carried bulk goods whose safe passage demanded careful stowage and constant monitoring. The vessel's steel hull, reinforced yet not impervious, had weathered countless Atlantic crossings, and its holds were designed to secure heavy loads against shifting waves. Despite meticulous planning, the ship's cargo created inherent vulnerabilities. Water intrusion, uneven distribution, or severe rolling could quickly compromise stability, especially under adverse conditions. Maritime records indicate that the freighter's weight and ballast were within prescribed limits, yet the ocean often proved unpredictable, able to exploit even minor structural or operational weaknesses. Currents shifted beneath the hull in subtle but insistent ways, and a growing breeze suggested that the sea might not remain passive for long. Forecasters later reconstructed the atmospheric conditions, noting low pressure areas advancing across the Sargasso Sea and abrupt squalls that could arise without warning. Ships travelling along the same corridor reported increasing chop and unusual turbulence, yet at the moment the Signa transmitted its routine updates, conditions remained manageable. Mariners of the time were accustomed to navigating under such circumstances, but the collision of natural forces could amplify unseen hazards, creating rapid shifts in a vessel's equilibrium. Routine radio exchanges kept both crew and shore informed, with weather acknowledgements and navigational confirmations providing reassurance across the miles of open water. Operators at coastal stations monitored hundreds of vessels daily, logging minor adjustments in course or noting favourable or deteriorating sea states. Such communications were often prosaic, a matter of procedure rather than urgency. On the Signa, these transmissions represented a reliable connection to the outside world, a channel that allowed the crew to report conditions and receive instructions in real time. The continuity of contact reassured both the crew and maritime authorities that the voyage was proceeding normally. The cut transmission arrived as expected, a brief acknowledgement of conditions that suddenly stopped, leaving operators listening to unbroken static. Acknowledged, weather clear, all secure. That was the last contact. The message was calm and methodical, the kind of routine check that had become habitual, yet the abrupt end left a void impossible to ignore. Radio technicians attempted repeated calls, but no response came from the freighter. The sudden absence of communication created an immediate sense of unease, contrasting sharply with the vessel's prior steadiness. The cut transmission became a haunting signal, its abrupt conclusion hinting at a rapid escalation of circumstances beyond the crew's control. Confusion rippled through monitoring stations as operators attempted to re-establish contact, scanning frequencies, repeating calls, and contacting nearby vessels. The lack of reply intensified concern, prompting protocols for search and alert. Ships in the vicinity altered course to investigate, and coordination with coastal authorities began, yet every attempt to communicate with the Signa yielded nothing. The silence that followed the cut transmission emphasized the suddenness of the disappearance, leaving only the memory of a ship whose final words were routine and composed before vanishing. Reviewing historical records, analysts noted that freighters of the Signa class were particularly sensitive to sudden weather shifts and shifting cargo loads, factors capable of destabilizing even experienced crews. Though no evidence indicated a mechanical failure, investigators considered the potential for a combination of high seas, rapid rolling, or water-entering cargo holds to have precipitated disaster. The vessel's design, while robust, had limits, and small breaches or imbalances could have grown catastrophic in minutes. Historical records emphasize that such ships often disappeared with little warning, their last transmissions ending without any indication of what had befallen them. Search parties scoured projected drift zones, scanning waves for the faintest trace of the freighter or its cargo, yet nothing emerged. Air patrols combed areas calculated from the Signa's last known position, while other ships covered surrounding waters in overlapping sweeps. Investigators hoped to recover lifeboats, oil slicks, or debris that could provide insight into the ship's final moments, yet the ocean refused to yield any evidence. Even after weeks of intensive searching, authorities could account for neither the crew nor the vessel, leaving a record defined more by absence than by discovery. Comparing the disappearance to other mid-century maritime losses, scholars and maritime historians recognized a recurring pattern in which abrupt communication cutoffs preceded total vanishing. The contrast between the calm tone of the final transmission and the suddenness of the silence suggested a catastrophe that occurred too quickly for additional reporting. In cases like these, the absence of intermediate signals often becomes the only clue, the silence itself forming the basis for speculation about mechanical failure, extreme weather, or structural compromise. Yet no physical evidence ever confirmed any particular scenario. The human element is impossible to reconstruct fully. The crew likely moved through normal bridge duties, attending to engine readings, navigating currents, and monitoring weather patterns, unaware of the forces converging against them. The cut transmission may have coincided with a moment when something shifted suddenly. A wave striking at an unusual angle, water breaching a hatch, or a mechanical failure that left no time for further radio communication. Whatever occurred, it erased all opportunity for warning or response, leaving only the interrupted message as testimony to their final moments. Maritime records preserve the incident as a lesson in how calm procedural signals can transform into a haunting silence when a vessel is swallowed by the sea. Unlike other cases where distress calls or partial transmissions provide at least fragments of narrative, the Signa's cut transmission represents a single definitive moment that abruptly ceased. Its brevity and clarity contrast with the total uncertainty that followed, shaping the vessel's legacy as a ghostly presence in shipping records and the imaginations of historians. Each attempt to reconstruct the voyage relies entirely on that last communication and the silence beyond it. Even decades later, analysts return to the cut transmission to explore every possible inference. From engineering assessments to meteorological studies, researchers attempt to imagine the sequence of events leading to the abrupt disappearance. Yet the Atlantic yields no corroborating evidence, no lifeboats, floating cargo, or hull fragments, and the vessel's fate remains concealed beneath unbroken waves. The silence emphasizes the fragility of human systems against the vast and unpredictable ocean, where routine signals can abruptly end and leave only questions. Over the restless sea, the MV Signa vanished, its final words hanging in silence and leaving only unanswered signals behind. The final deck check of MV Donapaz. Twilight settled across the Visayan Sea as the MV Donapaz prepared for another routine voyage, decks bustling with crew and passengers alike. The ferry moved steadily from Tacloban toward Manila, carrying hundreds of people on board along with cargo stowed in the lower holds. Life aboard the vessel appeared ordinary. Crew members performed familiar tasks, passengers navigated the narrow aisles of the deck and cabins, and the engines hummed in a predictable rhythm. No indication of impending disaster disturbed the calm. Only later would investigators recognize the ferry's final deck check as the last verified activity before catastrophe swallowed the vessel. Built to ferry hundreds across short sea passages, the Donapaz carried both cargo and human lives in proportions that would later draw scrutiny. The vessel's design featured multiple decks, with passenger cabins above and storage spaces below, yet safety regulations regarding lifeboat capacity and vessel loading were insufficient for the number of occupants it carried that night. Reports following the tragedy highlighted the ferry's overcapacity, noting that hundreds more people were on board than official records indicated. The discrepancy between official numbers and reality became a critical factor in understanding how quickly events escalated once the collision occurred. Waves lapped quietly against the hull, masking the currents that moved beneath, their influence subtle yet insistent in shaping the vessel's path. Weather conditions were generally calm, though visibility at night was limited, and the ferry's lights cut through the darkness in isolated beams. Mariners navigating these waters understood the risk posed by converging traffic lanes, especially along busy passages connecting small ports to Manila. Despite these challenges, the crew continued routine operations, trusting in navigational instruments and established protocols that had guided countless similar voyages safely in the past. Crew members moved through familiar motions, inspecting lifeboats, checking engine readings, and logging passenger counts, unaware that the day's final sweep would mark the last controlled activity aboard. The deck officers completed their inspection with methodical precision, ensuring that equipment functioned and that lifeboat stations were prepared for emergencies. Passengers strolled across the decks, some seated along railings enjoying the gentle evening breeze, others returning to cabins after meals. The ferry appeared secure, orderly and ordinary, the mundane certainty of daily routines providing a false sense of security that would vanish within minutes. The last deck check, recorded in the ship's log, appeared ordinary, an affirmation of safety procedures completed with calm precision. Logs indicated nothing out of the normal, no signs of structural strain or mechanical issues, and no reports of unusual behaviour among passengers or crew. This final inspection stands as a factual anchor, a last trace of human control and procedural diligence before the disaster unfolded. Historians and investigators alike have emphasised its significance, noting that the ferry's routine operations were the last known deliberate actions taken before events accelerated beyond comprehension. A sudden collision tore through the routine, as a freighter crossing the same waters struck the ferry, igniting fires and tearing open compartments below decks. The impact triggered rapid flooding that caused the vessel to list sharply to one side. Passengers scrambled across narrow walkways, many thrown into the rising water before lifeboats could be deployed, while crew members attempted to manage both panic and mechanical failure. The speed of the events ensured that no radio distress calls were successfully transmitted. The ferry's last moments were recorded only in survivor testimony, ship logs, and the debris that later surfaced in search operations. Passengers scrambled water-filled compartments, and the vessel began to list, while emergency protocols struggled to keep pace with the speed of the disaster. Some tried to climb toward the upper decks, and others sought assistance from crew members attempting to organise the evacuation. The fire spread rapidly, aided by fuel from both the ferry and the colliding freighter. Many passengers became trapped or swept overboard, and the chaos of the night compounded the already perilous situation. Survivors would later recall a sudden, almost incomprehensible series of events that left them clinging to floating debris, struggling against currents that dragged them away from the vessel. Investigators later confirmed that overloading and insufficient safety measures exacerbated the effects, transforming an otherwise survivable incident into a mass tragedy. Official reports highlighted the ferry's capacity violations and noted that available lifeboats were insufficient for the actual number of passengers. Regulatory lapses and procedural failures contributed directly to the scale of loss, while the vessel's structure and design limitations left little margin for error once flooding and fire began. The disaster stands as one of the deadliest maritime incidents in Philippine history, its scope magnified by the rapidity with which normal operations devolved into catastrophe. In the hours following the disaster, search parties combed the nighttime waters, retrieving bodies and debris, yet large swaths of the ferry and its occupants remained unrecovered, claimed by the dark sea. Helicopters and smaller boats moved through the illuminated corridors of water, recovering floating passengers and fragments of the vessel. The combination of nightfall, currents and the fires from the collision made searching difficult, and countless individuals were lost without a trace. Authorities catalogued recovered items and bodies carefully, seeking patterns that might indicate the final movements of the ship, but much remained unknown. Attention often falls on the final deck check as a symbolic moment, a mundane procedural action that stands in stark contrast to the catastrophe that followed. While the check itself revealed nothing amiss, its very ordinariness highlights the unpredictability of maritime disasters. Routine diligence, intended to secure the safety of passengers and crew, was rendered tragically insufficient against the sudden forces unleashed by human error, mechanical failure, and the unforgiving sea. The contrast between methodical procedure and sudden calamity underscores the fragility of even well-practiced safety measures. Survivors and families carry the memory of ordinary routines abruptly ending, a reminder that even careful preparation cannot always withstand sudden disaster. In the aftermath, investigations, memorials, and historical studies have emphasized the lessons of overcapacity, regulatory failure, and the importance of procedural vigilance. Yet the lasting impression remains the quiet, methodical actions of the crew during the last deck check, frozen in time as the final verifiable point of order before chaos overwhelmed all. In the dead of night, the MV Donapaz slipped beneath the waves, its last deck check the final trace of a world that vanished in a heartbeat. The unfinished report of SS Valencia. Waves rolled silently beneath the hull of the SS Valencia, carrying the vessel steadily along its charted course as officers prepared routine documentation. The cargo ship had left port with a standard manifest, a mixture of goods and a limited number of passengers, and the crew moved through established procedures, confident in the predictability of the voyage. The afternoon sun reflected off the water in shifting patterns, creating fleeting shadows across the decks. What began as a routine day gradually became defined by the final entries that would never reach completion, an unfinished record that would become the last trace of the ship's conscious activity. The ship's steel frame, designed for long-haul cargo, bore hundreds of tons of goods stacked in its holds, yet remained under the limits officially noted in port records. Its hull and superstructure had been inspected before departure, and engineers noted no immediate mechanical concerns. The Valencia's compartments were arranged to maximize cargo space while accommodating passengers, though cramped conditions made monitoring every area challenging. Despite this apparent readiness, the vessel carried the weight of both material and human responsibility, and any disruption to balance or stability could prove perilous in the unforgiving conditions of the open water. A shifting wind tugged at the ship's superstructure, hinting at subtle variations in the currents that would challenge navigation through the narrow channels ahead. Though the sea appeared calm on the surface, experienced officers were aware of the underwater forces at work, the unseen turbulence that could subtly affect course and speed. The faint creak of the hull, the rhythmic slap of waves against the bow, and the subtle sway of the decks reminded the crew that even routine voyages demanded constant vigilance. These conditions required careful adjustment of speed and steering, particularly in areas where strong tides met the coastline, a zone where even minor miscalculations could have serious consequences. Crew members moved with quiet efficiency, inspecting gauges, securing cargo, and recording observations in the ship's daily log as the vessel advanced. Officers noted ballast levels, checked engine readings, and ensured that passengers remained safely in cabins or on deck. These routine duties created a sense of order and discipline, a rhythm that guided the ship safely through each hour. Each action was deliberate, calculated, and entirely ordinary, yet these mundane tasks would become the last verifiable actions before disaster struck. The report in progress marked rising water in select compartments and listed engine readings, yet the entries ended abruptly before completion. Investigators later described this as the vessel's unfinished report, a document capturing the crew's final awareness of potential problems without the clarity of resolution. The partial report provided a factual anchor, revealing that the crew had observed issues severe enough to merit notation but insufficient time to finalize or send warnings. Its abrupt cessation reflected a sudden interruption, leaving the record suspended mid-action, frozen by forces unseen and unknowable. Maritime investigators later examined the partial document, noting its sudden cessation and using it as the last factual trace of the crew's actions. Analysts considered multiple scenarios: structural failure, navigational error, shifting cargo, or water ingress that compromised stability. Yet without corroborating evidence, none of these possibilities could be definitively confirmed. The unfinished report became a symbol of the ocean's indifference, a fragment of human diligence abandoned before fate intervened, and it has persisted as a central piece in the reconstruction of the ship's final moments. Recovery teams combed the surrounding waters for debris and any sign of survivors, yet large portions of the vessel and its occupants remained unaccounted for. Floating fragments of cargo and scattered personal effects were retrieved, but they offered little clarity regarding the sequence of events leading to the ship's disappearance. Search efforts extended across miles of coastline and open water, hampered by currents, tides, and fading light, leaving investigators reliant on the partial report and the scant physical evidence recovered. Each day, teams meticulously documented every find, yet every recovered fragment only deepened the sense of an incomplete story. Those analysing the unfinished record emphasised how it captured both diligence and vulnerability, a procedural act that now exists only in fragments. The entries revealed a crew aware of subtle threats, yet unable to fully communicate or mitigate them. Historians note that the Valencia's incomplete documentation illustrates the thin line between order and chaos at sea, how routine vigilance can coexist with imminent peril without warning. The unfinished report stands as a reminder that even careful observation cannot guarantee survival when unforeseen forces intervene. The partial document also offered insight into the operational mindset of maritime crews of the era, revealing their reliance on methodical reporting, redundancy checks, and regular monitoring of both machinery and cargo. The fact that these efforts were recorded yet abruptly halted underscores how sudden and unpredictable maritime disasters can be, leaving the most prepared and attentive crews with only fragments of evidence to recount their final acts. The unfinished report remains the final bridge between human intent and the unknown depths, an anchor of fact amid speculation. It is the last whisper of activity, composed in measured notes and careful observation, that reminds investigators, historians, and the world of the fragility inherent in maritime travel. The missing pages and unanswered conclusions leave only uncertainty, a record suspended in time as if the ocean itself pressed its hand upon the pen. Unfinished and unresolved, the SS Valencia's report became a silent testament, leaving the ocean as the sole witness to its final, interrupted record. The last words from SS Hans Hedtoft. The icy waters of the North Atlantic surrounded the SS Hans Hedtoft as it charted a course along Greenland's perilous coast, carrying passengers and cargo in a region where the sea is unforgiving. The vessel had been intended for northern service, its hull strengthened to withstand the pressure of drifting ice and turbulent currents, yet even such precautions could not shield it from the Arctic's sudden and invisible hazards. On board, the crew moved through the routine motions of navigation and watchkeeping, unaware that the vessel's final, fateful moments were approaching. Built as a sturdy cargo passenger ship, the vessel had been designed for northern waters, yet even its reinforced hull could not guarantee safety against unpredictable ice flows. Its compartments were arranged to transport cargo efficiently while accommodating passengers in modest cabins, with lifeboats stored along the deck in case of emergency. The design was considered robust for its time, yet in an area prone to floating ice and rapidly shifting weather, no ship could claim absolute invulnerability. Engineers had inspected the vessel before departure, noting only minor maintenance needs, and the route along Greenland's southern coast was familiar to the crew, often travelled despite its inherent dangers. Frigid winds whipped across the deck, while currents shifted beneath the surface, moving chunks of drifting ice and creating hazards that were almost invisible until impact. The sea appeared calm on the surface, a deceptive mirror over dangerous waters, yet the combination of ice and swift tidal movement made navigation precarious. Mariners relied on experience, ice charts, and constant observation, but the unpredictability of icebergs and smaller flows meant that even minor misjudgments could have catastrophic consequences. These forces, hidden beneath the waves or masked by fog, transformed routine passage into a race against nature's concealed threats. Officers monitored the instruments carefully, checked lifeboats, and maintained routine navigation logs. Their vigilance was standard yet essential in Arctic voyages. The crew conducted the usual checks of engine performance, bilge levels, and ballast distribution, while watchkeepers scanned the horizon for drifting ice. Each measure was deliberate, methodical, and grounded in protocol, reflecting the cautious discipline required to navigate northern waters. Yet even this diligence could not guarantee foreknowledge of sudden events, leaving the vessel and all aboard vulnerable to unseen dangers. Evidence indicates the ship struck sudden trouble, prompting a quick escalation from routine navigation to a critical emergency, leaving little opportunity for extended communication. Accounts suggest that water began entering compartments at a rate faster than the crew could manage, producing a perilous tilt and rapid flooding. The speed at which the crisis unfolded left the crew with virtually no time to send detailed reports or organise a coordinated evacuation. The ship's design, while reinforced, was insufficient to withstand the rapid breach, and within minutes what had been a routine voyage became a race for survival against the freezing Atlantic. The final transmission, recorded over the ship's radio, carried the stark and unambiguous message, "We are sinking." These 4 words, concise and urgent, constitute the only documented communication from the vessel during its last moments. They have been preserved in radio logs and maritime records as the final acknowledgement of imminent disaster, a brief but devastating confirmation that the crew recognised the severity of the situation even as the ship's fate was sealed. The brevity of the message emphasises both the suddenness of the emergency and the impossibility of elaborating on circumstances in the face of immediate peril. No further communications followed, and the extreme cold and rapid flooding left passengers and crew with almost no time to act, sealing the vessel's fate beneath the icy waters. Lifeboats, if deployed, were quickly overcome by the sea, and the sub-zero temperatures meant survival was extraordinarily brief. The vessel sank swiftly, carrying both cargo and human lives into depths that would remain undisturbed. The Arctic environment ensured that little physical evidence could persist. Any debris that floated briefly was quickly scattered or submerged by currents, leaving investigators with only fragments and the haunting final words as testimony to what had occurred. Rescue efforts were constrained by shifting ice and freezing temperatures, and though search teams scoured nearby waters, almost nothing could be recovered from the sinking. Aircraft and small boats combed the surrounding regions, following the route the ship had been expected to take, yet the combination of ice, wind and darkness limited visibility and effectiveness. Maritime authorities documented the search thoroughly, noting the extreme difficulty of recovery and the improbability of locating survivors, reinforcing the tragic certainty implied by the last words. Inscribed in the log, the final words possess a haunting clarity, highlighting how they crystallize both human awareness and helplessness in the face of the Arctic's indifferent forces. Unlike vessels that broadcast long or fragmented distress calls, the Hans Hedtoft communicated its dire situation in a single, urgent declaration. The recorded phrase has become emblematic of the dangers of northern navigation, a stark reminder of how rapidly circumstances can change at sea and how fragile human efforts remain against natural extremes. Through the icy expanse, the SS Hans Hedtoft's final words rang out, a stark declaration swallowed by ice and silence that left no trace of the souls who spoke them. The final position of MV Lama IV. The harbour waters of Hong Kong carried the MV Lama IV along its familiar route, a vessel whose schedules and paths were known to both passengers and maritime authorities. On board, hundreds of commuters and travellers followed their routines, unaware that the ordinary crossing would end in sudden catastrophe. The ferry had completed countless trips along this short but vital channel, moving between terminals with predictable regularity, and the crew operated under the assumption that the voyage would be uneventful, as it had for years. Yet the vessel's final moments would transform familiarity into tragedy, leaving only its last reported position as a stark and silent record of what had occurred. Designed as a small passenger ferry, the MV Lama IV accommodated hundreds, its decks and cabins arranged to maximise capacity while complying with safety regulations for local transport. The ship was a common sight in the harbour, ferrying workers, students and travellers along a route heavily trafficked by similar vessels. Safety equipment, including life jackets and lifeboats, was inspected regularly, and crew members were trained for emergencies. Despite this preparation, the compact size and a high passenger count meant that any accident could escalate rapidly, leaving little room for error or delay. The ferry's construction and operational protocols had met international standards, yet the event that unfolded would expose how quickly standard measures could be rendered insufficient. Currents and tides flowed predictably through the harbour, yet even in seemingly routine conditions, shifting winds and vessel traffic introduced potential hazards that required constant vigilance. Fog and low visibility sometimes compounded the risk, and narrow channels forced captains to manoeuvre carefully around other ships, floating debris and protruding piers. On the day of the incident, weather reports indicated calm conditions, yet the ever-present complexity of harbour navigation remained a factor that could turn routine crossings into crises. The harbour, usually a controlled and bustling environment, could turn treacherous in seconds when multiple vessels converged in proximity. Each shift saw crew members perform their duties with disciplined regularity, checking navigational instruments, monitoring speed, and ensuring passenger safety with procedures honed through repeated crossings. Watch officers maintained visual and radar surveillance, while deckhands attended to both cargo and passenger needs. Daily operations followed a rhythm familiar to everyone aboard, from the first departure in the morning to the final docking at the evening terminal. This rhythm, however, was not enough to shield the ferry from unexpected dangers that could arise in a fraction of a moment. The routine familiarity, once a source of confidence, would soon contrast tragically with the chaos that followed. The final communication, a standard location report sent to harbour authorities, indicated no unusual circumstances, a calm update that would be the vessel's last record of existence. The report confirmed the ferry's position and progress along the route, noting only routine details of speed and estimated arrival times. It was a message entirely ordinary in its tone and content, yet in retrospect it became the final link in the chain of evidence before the vessel disappeared from both radar and memory. There were no distress calls, no frantic pleas, and no hint that disaster was imminent. Maritime authorities later reviewed the logs, emphasizing that the lack of any abnormal signal heightened the mystery and underscored the abruptness of the sinking. Within minutes of that routine transmission, the ferry collided with another vessel, and the speed of the sinking left no time for additional messages or warnings. Witnesses on shore reported sudden splashes and the sounds of impact, but by the time assistance could be summoned, the MV Lama IV was already overwhelmed by water. Passengers struggled to find lifeboats, and crew members attempted to direct emergency procedures, but the rapidity of the event rendered these efforts almost entirely futile. The contrast between the calm update moments earlier and the sudden catastrophe heightened the sense of incomprehensible loss and left investigators with almost no first-hand accounts. Responding without delay, search and rescue teams faced a harbour whose geography, combined with swift currents and the scattering of debris, complicated the operation and left many questions unresolved. Boats and helicopters combed the waters, attempting to locate survivors or floating remnants of the ferry, but only fragments of the vessel and personal effects were recovered. Investigators noted how quickly debris drifted from the collision site, carried by tides and wind, leaving only scattered evidence of what had been a bustling ferry filled with people just minutes before. The silence of the waters became a haunting echo of lives and routines, interrupted without warning. Authorities also faced the challenge of coordinating with multiple agencies, as the crowded harbour required careful management of maritime traffic to avoid further incidents during the emergency. Rescue vessels had to navigate around piers, anchored ships, and ongoing commercial traffic, slowing their progress. Meanwhile, families of passengers waited anxiously along the shore, often learning details only through media updates or official briefings, heightening the human toll of the disaster and emphasizing the abrupt severing of normal communication between the vessel and the outside world. The event's chilling abruptness is emphasized by analysts and historians, noting that the ferry's final position report is the only remaining trace of a journey that vanished with startling suddenness. Unlike vessels that broadcast distress calls, the MV Lama IV left no words of warning, only a factual procedural report marking a point on navigational charts. That solitary report now represents the final acknowledgement of the ship's presence on the water, a reminder of how rapidly circumstances can change even in the midst of familiar, well-travelled routes. The meticulous record-keeping, routine inspections, and disciplined crew were all rendered irrelevant by a single, unforeseeable moment. Marked only on nautical charts, the MV Lama IV's last reported position remains a point on the water, a silent marker of a voyage cut short before anyone could fully understand what occurred. The last transmission of MV Lahula. The coastal waters off Gambia gleamed under a pale morning sun as the MV Lahula departed, carrying hundreds of passengers on what should have been an ordinary crossing. The ferry, a large roll-on/roll-off vessel designed to accommodate vehicles and people, had traversed this route countless times, its schedules familiar to locals and crew alike. The atmosphere on board was calm, a typical beginning to a journey that would tragically become one of the deadliest maritime disasters in recent African history. The routine nature of the voyage only deepened the shock that would follow, as passengers and crew soon faced circumstances far beyond expectation. Travellers moved along crowded decks and through narrow cabins, some leaning against railings to enjoy the morning breeze, while others prepared small meals or checked belongings. The vessel was loaded well beyond its official capacity, a factor that would later prove critical in the rapid escalation of events. Families travelled together, children wandered across the decks, and commerce flowed alongside the passengers, creating a normal yet precarious environment. Nothing suggested that the crossing would be disrupted, yet the sheer number of people on board magnified the consequences of any sudden danger. On the bridge, officers monitored navigation instruments and engine gauges with practiced attention. They noted the expected swell and the light wind blowing from the Atlantic, confident that the ferry could maintain stability despite the vessel's load. Routine checks of bilge pumps, fuel levels, and engine performance were completed without incident, reflecting the crew's reliance on both procedure and experience. Their careful observance offered the illusion of control, a stark contrast to the unforeseen disaster that would unfold only hours later. A steady wind rose from the Atlantic, tugging at ropes, stirring the decks and rolling lightly across the waves. What had been a moderate breeze slowly intensified, interacting with the vessel's heavy load in ways that made the ferry more sensitive to tilting. Passengers felt the gentle sway of the ship, a motion they assumed was routine, while officers began to adjust ballast and course slightly to compensate. This incremental tension set the stage for the rapid, uncontrollable instability that would soon consume the vessel. The ferry sent its final known message to harbour authorities, brief and urgent. Heavy winds, ship tilting dangerously, a lone transmission that would mark the ship's last recorded communication. The words conveyed awareness of imminent risk, but lacked any indication of the speed with which conditions would deteriorate. By the time this message was received, the ship was already beyond easy rescue, caught between wind, wave, and the limitations of its own design. It would become the sole verbal trace of the crew's awareness before catastrophe struck. Shortly after, the vessel began to list sharply, water rushing over the lower decks and sending passengers into panic. Chaos erupted as people scrambled for safety, many unable to reach life jackets or lifeboats in time. The ferry's top-heavy construction, combined with overcrowding, made it increasingly difficult to correct the tilt. Within moments, the situation escalated beyond control, turning a routine crossing into a desperate fight for survival. Vessels and rescue crews nearby moved quickly, yet the speed of the sinking and the force of the waves hampered their efforts. Debris and flailing passengers created hazards that slowed assistance, while strong currents carried survivors and wreckage away from the immediate scene. The Atlantic waters around the Gambian coast became a chaotic mosaic of life rafts, overturned vehicles, and the remnants of the ferry's infrastructure. Even experienced crews found it nearly impossible to approach safely in time to save many of those on board. Post-incident review of the ship's design highlighted vulnerabilities that exacerbated the disaster. The vessel's roll-on/roll-off configuration, intended for vehicles, combined with insufficient safety protocols and consistent overloading, rendered the ferry highly susceptible to heeling and heavy winds. Investigators concluded that the combination of natural forces and structural limitations left little chance for recovery once tilting began. The event illustrated the peril inherent in relying on routine measures in situations where environmental factors can quickly overpower design expectations. The brevity of the last transmission stands in stark contrast to the chaos that followed. In those few words, the crew acknowledged danger but could neither quantify it nor signal for immediate assistance. The urgency contained in heavy winds, ship tilting dangerously, communicates a fleeting window of awareness, a momentary connection between the vessel and the outside world that vanished almost as soon as it was sent. This concise alert remains the only recorded testament to the crew's knowledge of the unfolding peril. Recovery operations extended along miles of coastal waters, involving both local authorities and international aid. Debris, cargo, and personal effects were scattered widely, leaving a fragmented picture of the disaster. The lack of survivors able to recount the moments of sinking compounded the difficulty of reconstruction, leaving investigators to rely on environmental analysis, ship specifications, and the final transmission as the only clear evidence. The single communication thus became the anchor for understanding the ship's demise. The MV Gaul's final transmission now stands as the sole testament to the peril faced, a concise alert suspended above the Atlantic waters that swallowed the vessel. It represents a factual record amid the uncertainty, a brief acknowledgement of instability that underscores the rapidity and severity of the sinking. The tragedy is remembered through this signal, a haunting reminder of both human vulnerability and the ocean's unpredictable force. Its last words drift across the coastal waters, a haunting signal of danger that reached no one in time. The sudden radio break of SS Morro Castle. The Atlantic night embraced the SS Morro Castle as it cut a steady path along the eastern seaboard, its decks alive with passengers unwinding after dinner and crew completing routine checks. The vessel had long been a familiar sight along this route, a symbol of speed and comfort for travellers between New York and Havana. Its steel hull reflected the faint moonlight, while the hum of engines reverberated through cabins and corridors. Nothing suggested that within hours the ship would descend into chaos and tragedy, leaving only fragments of its existence behind. A faint haze began to creep along the lower decks, unnoticed at first, as officers carried out standard rounds among cabins and machinery spaces. The smell of smoke was subtle, easily mistaken for kitchen fumes or mechanical warmth, yet it hinted at a developing hazard below decks. Crew members occasionally paused, adjusting their routines without alarm, as the vessel's design and past performance had fostered confidence in their ability to manage small incidents. Passengers remained largely unaware, moving between decks, socializing, or preparing for an evening of rest. Within moments, the subtle signs of trouble intensified, smoke curling upward and mingling with the evening breeze, hinting at the peril that would soon erupt. Fire had ignited somewhere within the engine room, likely fueled by oil and electrical systems, and began spreading along corridors and compartments. Officers reported unusual heat and flickering lights, quickly mobilizing to contain the hazard, yet the ship's construction, designed for efficiency rather than fire suppression, hampered rapid containment. The narrow passageways and flammable materials allowed flames to advance faster than crew efforts could manage. A single urgent transmission pierced the night. "Fire aboard!" A message so brief it barely hinted at the inferno consuming the vessel before radio silence claimed the bridge. This last communication captured the attention of coastal authorities and nearby ships, but arrived too late to offer meaningful intervention. The brevity of the signal reflected the speed and intensity of the fire, and the sudden cut-off left all monitoring stations with only a grim acknowledgement of danger. It would remain the sole recorded plea from the ship, a final trace of awareness before disaster fully unfolded. Passengers scrambled across corridors and stairwells, their panic amplified by choking smoke and the uncertainty of which exits led to safety. Many attempted to don life jackets, while others sought guidance from crew members who themselves were struggling to navigate the inferno. The ferry's design, with limited emergency exits and crowded stairwells, contributed to widespread confusion. Flames leaped across decks and stairwells, cutting off access to lifeboats and leaving some trapped in cabins or hallways. Eyewitness reports described a scene of frantic movement against a backdrop of crackling fire and blinding smoke. Alerted by the call, surrounding ships adjusted course, crews bracing against waves and night shadows to reach the Morro castle before the fire could engulf it. Rescue attempts were hampered by the vessel's sudden list, the rapid spread of fire, and the darkness that concealed hazards in both the water and on the ship itself. Those responding from other ships could only observe flickers of flame and the occasional silhouette of a passenger cast into the air as sections of the Morro castle became fully engulfed. The chaos unfolded faster than any coordinated effort could contain, leaving only partial recoveries in the aftermath. Investigators later traced the blaze to the engine compartment, analysing the spread and noting how structural vulnerabilities accelerated the disaster despite the crew's efforts. The ship's design, which included open access between decks and insufficient fireproofing, allowed flames to travel unchecked. Electrical wiring and fuel lines likely fueled the rapid progression, while firefighting equipment proved inadequate for the scale of the emergency. Reports documented that the vessel's age and modifications over the years had introduced additional points of weakness, turning what might have been a contained incident into an uncontrollable catastrophe. The suddenness of the catastrophe and the incompleteness of the ship's final communications left maritime historians with only fragments of understanding and a stark sense of unanswered urgency. Survivors' accounts, although harrowing, could not reconstruct every moment, leaving gaps in the timeline of the fire's origin, spread, and ultimate impact. The final transmission, brief and interrupted, became the anchor for all reconstructions, a single verbal thread amid a night defined by destruction, smoke, and silence. Analysts repeatedly noted how little warning could be given when fire progressed so swiftly through a passenger vessel. The SS Morro Castle's last transmission now exists as both a historical record and a symbol of human vulnerability at sea. It reflects the fleeting window in which the crew recognized the peril and attempted to alert the world, a moment quickly swallowed by fire, smoke, and darkness. Every detail of the disaster, from the rapid onset to the incomplete evacuation, reinforces the fragility of maritime life in the early 20th century, before modern safety standards could mitigate such rapid, deadly events. Suspended above the dark waters, the SS Morro Castle's last words were a fleeting alarm that vanished before any hand could grasp its meaning. The drowning signal of SS Princess Sophia. The SS Princess Sophia navigated the narrow channel with precise attention to its instruments. Each dial and gauge was monitored as the vessel carried hundreds along the Lynn Canal. On board, routine operations proceeded with quiet efficiency, a rhythm established over countless voyages connecting Skagway and Juneau. The crew's focus was on maintaining course through the deep fjord waters, a narrow artery bordered by steep, unforgiving cliffs, where one miscalculation could prove disastrous. Even in calm conditions, the Lynn Canal demanded constant vigilance, yet nothing in the early reports suggested the disaster that would soon unfold, leaving investigators and historians to wonder how such a heavily monitored passage could claim a ship almost without warning. Engineers noted unusual strain in the propeller shafts, subtle vibrations that hinted at hidden hazards lurking beneath the cold, dark waters. These early warnings, though minor, underscored the vessel's exposure to a complex maritime environment shaped by submerged rocks and shifting currents. Despite these signs, the captain maintained course, relying on the experience of the crew and the ship's sturdy construction. Modern accounts of the incident would later emphasize that nothing in the routine logs suggested catastrophic mechanical failure. Yet, even a well-maintained vessel could be at the mercy of the canal's unpredictable forces. Tidal charts indicated rapidly changing currents, forcing the helmsman to adjust the ship's heading repeatedly as the waters pressed against the hull with growing force. The surrounding topography amplified the natural turbulence of the channel, funneling wind and water in ways that made small course corrections essential for safe passage. Navigators relied on past charts, local knowledge, and radio updates, but the dynamic conditions demanded constant attention. Each adjustment made by the bridge was recorded in meticulous logs, the kind of procedural detail that would later become the last concrete traces of the ship's journey before tragedy struck. From the bridge came a brief and urgent call that would become the vessel's last recorded words. "Worsening grounding, taking water fast," a stark signal of the crew's desperate awareness. This transmission, though short, revealed the immediate danger confronting those aboard, the realization that the vessel had become firmly stuck and was beginning to flood in critical compartments. Analysts later noted the chilling precision of the words, a direct acknowledgement of imminent disaster, leaving no ambiguity about the ship's peril. For those monitoring the radio, the call represented the final human element in a disaster that would quickly escalate beyond their ability to respond. Struggling against rising water, crew members moved passengers toward lifeboats and safety stations, each effort slowed by the chaos of a rapidly deteriorating situation. Cold, turbulent water had begun creeping across decks, soaking clothes and chilling those who scrambled to reach safety equipment. Lifeboats were deployed as quickly as possible, yet the narrow confines of the ship and the heavy load of passengers created bottlenecks and delays. Historians emphasize that even small procedural lapses could compound the disaster, and the Princess Sophia's rapid descent into the water left almost no room for orderly evacuation. Submerged rocks and sudden shoals forced course corrections that tested even experienced navigators. The vessel's progress was impeded at every turn. These natural obstacles, invisible from the surface until too late, contributed to the grounding and subsequent flooding. Later examinations of the canal's underwater topography confirmed that this particular section was among the most hazardous along the route. For decades, the complexity of these waters has been cited as a reminder of how even familiar channels can become deadly when routine precautions collide with unpredictable hazards. Nearby patrol boats and coastal stations monitored radio signals, but distance and treacherous currents prevented them from reaching the ship in time. Observers could hear fragments of transmission, yet the vessel was already in a precarious position, the combination of the grounding and water intake creating an emergency too severe for a rapid response. Despite heroic attempts, rescue teams were forced to remain at the edge of the unfolding catastrophe, unable to prevent the loss of the ship and the lives aboard. When the wreckage was finally examined, investigators found only scattered personal belongings and fragmentary evidence, leaving the exact sequence of the disaster unresolved. Clothing, furniture, and small cargo items were washed ashore or recovered from shallow waters, but no part of the hull survived intact. These remnants provided some context for the ship's final moments, yet the silence of the vessel itself left the story incomplete. Scholars and maritime analysts have long reflected on how the absence of a complete physical record intensifies the haunting mystery of the Princess Sophia's fate. The brief transmission endured in maritime records as the last trace of life aboard, a chilling reminder that even routine voyages could end in unrelenting disaster. Every detail recorded before the transmission's end has been scrutinized for clues, yet the isolation of the Lynn Canal and the nature of the accident meant that human and material evidence alike vanished into the frigid waters. The transmission remains the sole confirmed communication from a crew that fought valiantly, but could not overcome the forces arrayed against them. In the icy canal, the SS Princess Sophia's last signal hung momentarily, a fleeting alarm that would never return, swallowed by the waters,